Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second day of the 9th ASEAN Competition Conference. Before we begin with the official proceeding, please allow me about 10-15 minutes to provide a wrap-up of what happened on the first day. This is mainly for the benefit of those participants who have been otherwise engaged during the first day and could not join us. For those who have been there and done that, please bear with us for the first 10-15 minutes. So the first day comprised of 2 sessions for setting the scenes and 2 panel discussions on specific topics of the conference. The first scene setting of the conference, of course, introduced us to the ASEAN Competition Action Plan 2025 and the outcomes of its midterm review conducted last year in 2020 by the ASEAN Expert Group on Competition. I say of course because when we talk about competition issues at the national level, the competition law and the competition authority would be the first that comes to our mind. And similarly, when we have a regional conference on competition in ASEAN, the ACAP and the AECC would naturally stand at the first place. The ACAP charts the code of action by the AECC in building an effective and progressive competition regime with strengthened capacity in the region by 2025. With its strategic goals, expected outcomes, and deliverable, the ACAP is the nearest equivalent to regional competition law and policy that conference that in the first 5 years of the ACAP implementation, from 2016 to 2020, the ASEAN has made good progress. Out of the total number of 41 deliverables under the 5 strategic goals of the plan, more than 40% have been completed and only about 19% are yet to be implemented. The ACAP is thought to possess a significant level of coherence with the overall AEC blueprint, the changing landscape internationally and regionally. Its goals, initiatives, and outcomes are found to be highly relevant to the context at the national level of the ASEAN member states, as well as to the needs and priorities of AECC members. These goals and outcomes will become even more relevant in the time to come because the focus has now shifted from introducing competition law to more effective enforcement and cooperation among AMS. Accordingly, several new deliverables are to be expected according to the implementation plan of the ACAP for the period of 2021 to 2025. These include, among others, the development of an ASEAN information portal on merger cases, an ASEAN investigation manual on competition policy and law for the digital economy, as well as the meetings of heads of the competition agency in ASEAN from 2021 onwards. Now, the second scene setting session of the last day dealt with the other elephant in the room, as I call it, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has led to serious disruption in the global economy and a lot of changes in people's lives. In particular, ever since the start of the pandemic in 2020, internet traffic has significantly increased due to lockdown and closures, forcing people to study or work remotely. Applications such as Zoom, Microsoft Teams, or Google Classroom have become essential in facilitating the shift toward online classes, meetings, and get-together. Due to the increasing importance of internet connectivity, the topic of net neutrality has garnered considerable attention. The paper presented in this session by Mr. Yogi Bhattacharya highlighted to us how competition law enforcement could help to ensure that there is healthy competition amongst internet service providers while promoting consumers' access to online content instead of a blanket regulation on net neutrality. The commentators in the session were Professor Sakon Varuniyu-Watana, Chairman of the Trade Competition Commission of Thailand, Dr. Chandra Setiawan, Commissioner of the Indonesian Competition Commission, and Dr. Nguyệt Anh Tuấn from L&T and Partners, Vietnam. They share about the impacts that the pandemic had on the national economy and markets of their respective countries, some notable cases, and the action that the competition authorities of Thailand, Indonesia, and Vietnam have taken to address these issues. The impacts, as we are all acutely aware, range from price increase due to the practice of price gouging by some market players, or simply due to the disrupted supply chains and general shortage of essential goods and services. The impact also includes the accelerated digital adoption in many countries because both producers and consumers had to move online due to lockdowns and travel restrictions. And of course, the changing market structure because of rising concentration level, merger and acquisition, and the crowding out of smaller firms. 2 points from the discussion that left very big impression on me were, firstly, the difficulty in communication and the lessening in business willingness to consult the competition authority. This points to the need for the authorities to be more proactive in reaching out to the business community and providing information about what they can do, what they cannot do, or what they should do, in addition to regular enforcement and monitoring activity. The second one is the need to continue to uphold the principle of competitive neutrality in the time of the pandemic as well as afterwards. This would ensure that whatever support that governments are injecting into the market to boost economic recovery would apply equally and fairly across the board, instead of concentrating on a few state-owned enterprises. Then came the first panel discussion on maintaining business compliance. The paper presented in this session by Ms. Amira Effendi pointed out how mega platforms such as Grab and Gojek have emerged and grown indispensable to consumers in this context, riding on the wave of pandemic-forced lockdown and accelerated digital adoption, giving rise to serious competition concerns with their relentless growth strategies. Though equally severe to competition principle, it is no longer just a question of size and market share when these giants merge with each other or acquire other businesses. Increasingly, data is seen as an asset that cannot be replicated by competitors. A more comprehensive and honest review of the role of data in competition regulation is necessary in ensuring that competition enforcement is sustainable and effective. In the ASEAN, the lack of harmonized laws and regulation would increase the risk of these mega corporations to slip through enforcement loopholes. Therefore, we need smarter and more coordinated enforcement strategies through merger and acquisition regulation. We need more harmonized competition rules within the region and a paradigm shift from a limited market definition approach to be able to make competition enforcement more effective. Three commentators in the session Ms. Phan Van Hang from the VCCA, Mr. Sam Scott from the CMA, and Mr. Kenter Doi from the JFTC all agree with this need to use competition policy and law to enable continuous business activity and growth during the pandemic, as well as to ensure that no opportunistic anti-competitive practices during the economic recovery would escape the scrutiny and enforcement action by the competition authorities. In addition to sharing their experience with regard to the measure or step that the authority of Vietnam, the UK, and Japan have taken and are continuing to carry out, the commentators also pointed to the importance of collaboration amongst the authorities to address these big international challenges posed by the pandemic and the big tech companies. The last session of the day, or the second panel discussion, dealt with the topic of the increasing importance of competition policy for micro, small, and medium enterprise in the post-pandemic area. As we know, competition law policies strive to ensure a level playing field for all market players, and that actually work to the benefits of MSMEs, who often suffer from comparative disadvantages compared to larger competitors, therefore making them more vulnerable to unilateral actions by large companies. The size and the scope of MSME also make it impossible for them to successfully carry out and derive profits from anti-competitive practices due to the negligible competitive impacts. As a result, many competition laws, including in the ASEAN region, contain exemptions and exceptions for MSME. ASEAN competition authorities are well aware of this issue and have instituted many mechanisms for raising the awareness and encouraging compliance among MSMEs, cultivating allies, friends of competition, and of course, whistleblower. Competition advocacy is therefore an important topic in the ACAP and will continue to be a priority for AMS in the coming time. The paper presented in this session by Ms. Nancy Kai shows us how MSME could be deprived of the opportunity for market participation and growth due to the lack of broadband connectivity. The problem has its root in the monopolization of internet infrastructure, or in other words, the submarine cable system by internet behemoth. With prominent subsea cable system nearing retirement and the surge in bandwidth demand, it is extremely important that regional cooperation and policies set the appropriate safeguards to ensure access to critical digital infrastructure, including the cable system. According to Ms. Kai, by applying open access principle of non-discrimination, transparency, and cost-oriented pricing measures to cable facility, small businesses access to landed capacity and co-location space in cable landing station should ideally be under the same terms and conditions as member of the cable consortium. As a result, emerging and developing economies in ASEAN can see borderless opportunity enabled by bandwidth rather than an exacerbated digital divide and stifle competition. The commentators in the session was Mr. Meng Song Thang from the CCCF in Cambodia, Siti Maulana Manaf from MICC, and Ms. Rachel Burgess from the University of Southern Queensland, Australia. The commentators all agree on the roles that MSME play with regard to economic development, job and income generation, as well as innovation and business dynamism in general, and in respective economies of Cambodia, Malaysia, and Australia. At the same time, MSME also tend to be more ignorant of competition rules and its relevance to their business activity. Therefore, they could still fall foul of the law, for instance, by unwittingly joining anti-competitive agreements formed under the purview of trade or SME association. Or they are less likely to lodge their complaints to the competition authorities even when they are victimized by the anti-competitive activities by larger enterprises. The experts, however, suggested that competition authorities should maintain a softer approach toward MSMEs, with focus on more on warning, education, and maintaining dialogues rather than strict enforcement. In summary, I could see that there were two red threads cutting across all this session and getting highlighted by almost every panelist yesterday. One is that the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated digital adoption in all the countries. As a result, we see that the number of competition cases in the e-commerce sector has increased, as well as the market power of digital platforms and internet companies. This points to the need for competition authority to increase the enforcement so as to ensure business compliance and ensure the legitimate interest and vitality of MSME in the market. And two, there is a need to promote inter-agency collaboration within and beyond the ASEAN to deal with competition challenges that are global in nature. Therefore, in the long run, ASEAN countries should aim for more consistency, conversion, and eventually harmonization of competition rules and regulation. This brings us nicely to the topics of day 2 of the conference with another two highly interesting panels. The first one is on the digital economy and risk pertaining to competition enforcement. And the second one on the topic of strengthening cooperation and in anticipation of future crises. Before I hand over to my colleague, Gwen, to introduce you to the proceeding of today, I would like to go over the rules of conduct again for the benefit of those new participants. For the rules of conduct, would you, we request you to kindly change your name to the format of your country following by your full name. Any question that you might have for the speakers and panelists could be raised by a Slido using the QR code on the screen right now. Yeah, and with that, thank you very much for your attention. Wen, I would hand over to you now to manage the proceeding.
Good afternoon to our esteemed guests and participants. I would like to thank Alice, our conference co-convener, for the comprehensive wrap-up of day 1 and introducing today's agenda, which I am sure have been helpful for our participants, especially those joining the conference for the first time today. I am Gwen Grecia de Vera from the Philippines, one of the conveners for the 9th ASEAN Competition Conference, and I would like to welcome everyone to the panel sessions this afternoon. For panel 3 this afternoon, we have learned from day 1 how the COVID-19 pandemic has led to the prompt adoption of technology and propelled the shift to the digital economy. From the pervasiveness of food delivery and small package delivery services to the growth of online markets, transactions and interactions are increasingly taking place online. While this development has eased the impact of the pandemic and generated new opportunities, it has also posed challenges for policymakers in developing strategies and approaches to promote and protect competition in the digital markets and avoid the marginalization of MSMEs. Panel 3 will address how competition authorities should review the existing tools to achieve policy objectives while avoiding harm to innovation and competition. For our third panel on the rapid shift towards the digital economy and the risk to competition enforcement, it is my privilege to introduce our moderator, commentators, and speakers. Our moderator for this panel is Mr. Iskandar Ismail, Chief Executive Officer of the Malaysia Competition Commission, to offer their respective interventions as commentators. We are fortunate to have a distinguished panel with us. Mr. Rod Sims, Chairman of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, Mr. Soo-Yoon Yoon, Commissioner of the Korea Fair Trade Commission, Mr. Luke Shu Meng, Assistant Chief Executive of the Competition and Consumer Commission of Singapore, and Professor Julie Clark, Associate Dean and Director of Studies, Competition and Consumer Law at Melbourne University of Melbourne. Presenting on online platforms in a lockdown economy, an ASEAN market experience, our speakers this afternoon are Mr. Abraham Alonso Giab, General Counsel, Uploan PH, and Ms. Maria Froline May El Rapal, Junior Associate Lawyer. I would like to invite our moderator, commentators, and speakers to take the virtual floor. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Yes, thank you so much, Gwen, for the introduction. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, welcome all to the panel discussion 3 on the topic, the rapid shift towards the digital economy and the race to competition enforcement. My name is Iskandar Ismail. I will be your moderator for this session. Yeah, I would like just to go to the flow of our panel discussion. We start with the presentation by Ms. Rapal and Mr. Guya. Yeah, for everybody's information, their article with the title of Online Platforms in the Lockdown Economy in an ASEAN Market Experience won the ANSFATA Competition Law Essay Contest. Congratulations to them. Yeah. So let me just introduce a bit more about Ms. Rapal and Ms. Guyab. Mr. Guyab, Ms. Rapal, she is in private practice in Philippines. Her practice area is quite diverse. She's in immigration, but at the same time, she's in telecommunications, data privacy rules, consumer rights, and competition law. She has published some works on civil law, constitutional law, and the Competition Act. Mr. Guillaume is an emerging expert on Philippine competition law, at the same time technology law specialist. He had done his legal thesis on the law and participated in a congressional bicameral committee on the passage of the bill, as well as producing academic literature. Okay, so let us start with the presentation. Ms. Rapal, Mr. Guya, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Chief Executive Officer Iskandar. So, Xin Chao, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for this opportunity to speak before distinguished experts in the field of competition. Now, just to provide a brief overview, our essay focuses on how the onslaught of the COVID-19 pandemic affected the Philippine digital market economy, and the same analyzes legislation of advance of foreign jurisdictions. If I may just check if the PowerPoint presentation is being presented at the moment. I will just continue on. I'm assuming the hosts are already. Oh, there you go. Thank you very much for that. So, can we please change to slide 3, please? Thank you. So the Philippines has imposed one of the longest lockdowns in the world, with our cases ranging for almost 20,000 cases a day. And Filipinos are forced to stay home because of that. And a problem now arises on how we shop for basic necessities. So during this pandemic, our shopping seasons are highlighted in double digits in the likes of 10-10, 11-11, and 12-12, the oncoming sale. Now, it is during these times that digital platforms like Shopee and Lazada give out the biggest deals and discounts, encouraging us online shoppers to shop. Now, next slide, please. If we take a look into the market structure of the Philippine economy, we can see that 99.51% of it is composed of micro, small, and medium enterprises. However, given that there is the onslaught of the COVID-19 pandemic, these enterprises are then forced to shift into digitalization. Next slide, please. Now, a question arises as to how the pandemic shaped the Philippine digital economy. As you can observe, there is a 66% decrease in travel. Now, this is because there are nationwide imposed lockdowns and even companies have shifted to work from home arrangements. Meanwhile, there is an increase in of new consumers participating in digital service and also an increase in usage of food delivery service, mobile banking apps, and e-commerce usage. So clearly, COVID-19 has caused a rapid shift for the Philippine market economy to go digital. Next slide, please. For regulation, at present, there is no concrete law as far as how competition issues in digital platforms are being governed in the Philippines. However, there are certain government agencies that have some sort of regulation with regard to certain applicable laws. For instance, the PCC or the Philippine Competition Commission applies the Philippine Competition Act. The Department of Trade and Industry applies the Consumer Protection Act. The Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas applies the National Payment Systems Act, among others. So considering this, an analysis of competition laws from more advanced jurisdictions are relevant. Our essay touched on 4 jurisdictions. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, for the first jurisdiction, which is the European Union, it sought to enforce a digital sector regulation based on 2 proposed laws. The first is the Digital Markets Act, which classified large platforms as gatekeepers. So these gatekeepers bridge the relationship between a buyer and a seller. Since businesses are dependent on gatekeepers, they are commonly placed in a dominant position, rather needing regulation. Second, the Digital Services Act focuses on overseeing online user content. And this introduced the concept of very large platforms, referring to those which have more than 45 million users, or at least 10% of the EU's population. Next, we go to the United Kingdom. For it to address issues on competition and consumer rights, the UK sought to create the Digital Markets Unit, who is responsible for designating firms as having strategic market status, and they analyze it based on market power and its ability to cause potential anti-competitive harm. Next, for Japan, the regulators in this country considered platforms to be as specified digital platforms based on their total domestic sales. So not all platforms are regulated, but only those that reach a certain threshold amount. And finally, we go to South Korea, which enacted a new law, which is a first of its kind. It prohibited app store owners like Apple and Google from forcing developers to use in-house payments. So an analysis of the competition regulation on digital platforms enacted by these foreign jurisdictions provide relevant insight for the Philippines to similarly consider in applying it in our jurisdiction. I now turn over my presentation to Attorney Dia for its continuation. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Lane. So preliminarily, why did we distinguish between the formal and informal economy in this presentation? There's certainly a distinction that exists in the broader economy, but I think that we can see here that there are unique circumstances that emerge when you translate this to a platform economy. As you can see here in the slide, we've done a comparison. For instance, players in the formal economy tend to be more compliant with regulation they are subject to, particularly in terms of permitting and invoicing, but not so for the informal sector, which is partly the reason why they are capable of setting up so rapidly. We can also see that while they may both maintain store pages or an online presence, the way that you interact with such pages is markedly different. A formal store, for example, will rely on verification software or third-party mechanisms, whereas informal merchants rely broadly on trust. Likewise, formal sellers can benefit from electronic and cashless payment, including the various modes of credit products fintechs offer, but not so for informal sellers who have to rely on either cash-based transactions or cash on delivery. And lastly, the personal component. Formal stores can operate 24/7 as the websites themselves handle transaction processing, whereas personal interaction is entirely optional. But for informal sellers, this absolutely depends on personal interaction to close transactions. So next slide, please. So how do we see this factoring in? What we see here ultimately is that we are noticing the classification of PH digital platforms may be said to include those which include the logistics and fintech aspect. And we are seeing that as a challenge, the limitations of MSMEs and informal economy participants to venture further into digital platforms, and that it is a sector with significant regulatory overlaps. Next slide, please. So what do we believe will be a way forward here? What we can see here is that ultimately, the formal merchants and participants in the platform economy are underpinned mainly by the technology and the infrastructure, whereas the informal participants are fueled mainly by trust and their ability to develop workarounds to existing limitations. So, what does this mean for regulators? There should be a holistic approach to platform regulation that takes into account the unique network effects with other technologies. So, the interaction, for example, between small parcel logistics and platforms. In addition, we also need to monitor the effect of allied industries on terms of platform development, particularly such as financial inclusion initiatives, or perhaps the exclusion or increase in cashless adoption, because this will have a material effect on platform economies and how more people will transition. Lastly, we also should develop means for protecting any vested proprietary rights in social media platform presence, as at present, participants on these platforms are generally subject to the community standards of these platforms, which tend to be more under their control. So moving forward, I believe that we should be able to allow people more control over their own presence and to protect their vested proprietary rights. Thank you, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Ms. Rapal and Ms. Guya, for the excellent presentation. Okay, now let's go to the commentators. I would like to reiterate our commentators. The first commentator is Mr. Rod Sim. He is the current chairman of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. And then we have Mr. Lok Shoo Meng. He is the Assistant Chief Executive for Legal Enforcement and Consumer Protection of the Competition and Consumer Commission of Singapore. And we have Mr. Yoon Soo Hyun from Seoul. He is the standing commissioner of the Korean Fair Trade Commission. And last but not least, we have Professor Dr. Julie Clark. She is the professor in competition law and associate dean for digital technologies at the University of Melbourne Law School. Okay, let me go to Mr. Rod Sim. How are you, Mr. Sim?
Very well, thank you, and delighted to be here and wonderful time zone. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. My first question is that as you can see, the presentation highlighted the new regulatory measures that have been implemented in some foreign jurisdictions that aim to promote competition in digital markets. Do you think these measures are sufficient, and why?
First of all, let me congratulate the authors of the paper. I enjoyed reading it, and it's a very good paper, so absolutely well done. And with many aspects to it. Look, at a high level, I think these regimes are important. They should go ahead. They're very different. But I think the thrust of these sorts of measures are what we need. If you look at, basically, I think we do need more pro-competition ex-ante rules. There's a big debate about whether you call that regulation or you call it more clear things you can and can't do under competition law being set out in an ex-ante fashion. But I think that is needed, and I think the transparency that's provided is needed as well. Obviously, in the I mean, the UK and the US, the UK and the EC are providing a lot of, as I say, things you can't do. The UK is doing it through a flexible code. The UK is doing it, the EC is doing it through more hard and fast rules. But basically, they will be dealing with things like self-preferencing, judging that trying to take cases using anti-monopoly law or unilateral conduct law is going to take a long time. It's going to be very narrow cases, which won't actually solve the broader problem. But if you set up some upfront rules about what you can and can't do from a competition perspective, that I think will lead to a more competitive outcome and better outcomes for consumers. Looking at the Korean laws, I mean, they are basically prohibiting the App Store owners from forcing apps to use the in-house payment system, as mentioned. To get that result through competition enforcement, I think would take a long time and it would be uncertain. I think personally it is problematic behaviour from a competition point of view. We really only have 2 app stores in the world, particularly if you're using mobile devices. So preventing them doing that, I think, is helpful. And of course, the Japanese regime with greater transparency. So I think all these things are useful steps. The point I make about doing it through conventional after the event enforcement is not only the time it takes, but you are talking 5 years from start to finish, but also that to win the case, you often narrow the case. And in narrowing the case, you might win a certain point, but you don't actually affect the underlying behaviour and the underlying problem as much as you can with the sort of rules that were talked about for the EC, the UK, Japan and Korea. We in Australia are watching all these developments really carefully. We're going to be spending 2022 seeing what we should do in Australia, which of these regimes should we adopt, how should we do it. So I think getting as much alignment as we can is useful, and we're certainly going to be taking very close account of what's been done there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have another question, Mr. Sims. As you can see in the presentation, we highlighted that there are many challenges to this the rapid growth in this area. One of the challenges is regulatory overlap. Yeah, where 2 areas of the law may intersect, such as competition and privacy. How has the ACCC dealt with these overlapping regulatory regimes? And do you have any suggestion to us, especially the young competition agencies in ASEAN, on how to go about it?
Look, it's a really important topic. Thank you very much for the question. The ACCC is the competition enforcer. We enforce consumer law and we regulate infrastructure, particularly telecommunications, but also other infrastructure. So we have a lot of interaction with other regulators. Some of them come to our commission meetings. Some of them are associate commissioners, which keeps us very close to them. Privacy, I think, when you're dealing with digital platforms, is a crucial regulator to deal with. Now, we take consumer law cases. Sometimes they could be seen to overlap with privacy cases. And of course, you mentioned in a competition as well. What we do is we have constant interaction with those other regulators. We both try and decide who does what so that there's no overlap and also there's nothing falling through the cracks. But we try and take a broad approach to what we're doing. So if you think about many of the competition issues in relation to digital platforms, there's a lot of people out there saying the best way to do this is data sharing, interoperability, portability. And if you're going to take forward those ideas from a competition perspective, you need to be talking very closely with the privacy regulator so that you're not solving one problem and creating a big one. And you can see that with data sharing. I can see the competition sense in it, but what about the privacy issues? So I think my advice is consult in an extensive way with those other regulators. Don't take too narrow approach. Don't just look in a very narrow way. Embrace their views and you'll get the best outcome. Having all regulators aligned is fundamental. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sim. Let me jump to Mr. Xu Ming. Mr. Xu Ming, the presentation also touched on the formal and informal e-commerce economy. Most MSMEs prefer informal e-commerce, it seems, in Philippines. What do you think may be the potential concerns if the MSME move towards adopting the formal e-commerce? And do you have any tips for us on how to tackle the issues?
Yeah, thank you very much, Pak Iskandar, and thank you everybody for giving me the opportunity to participate in today's panel. To the question that's posed, I think in Singapore, the informal e-commerce economy is a relatively small one as compared to our formal e-commerce economy. As such, when we embarked on our e-commerce platform study back in 2020, we didn't quite cover this particular aspect of the economy. Although the experience in the Philippines suggests that many MSMEs prefer informal e-commerce channels currently, there may very well be a shift towards formal e-commerce channels over time in view of some of the potential benefits that can be brought about by such an economy. In Singapore, a formal e-commerce economy is one that's characterized by e-commerce platforms that compete in multiple market segments that offer a wide range of distinct products and services, including e-payment, logistics, fulfillment, and delivery services within a single app. While such e-commerce platforms provide benefits to sellers and buyers, such as greater efficiency, convenience, and cost savings, the features that actually make them attractive may very well also result in user stickiness to these platforms. And because of the stickiness of these platforms, it actually does strengthen the network effects that these platforms enjoy and also entrenches the market power of these platforms. And once you see an increase in entrenchment of market power, the platforms may then become gateways between businesses, users, and buyers. And this may actually allow them to leverage on this market power to behave in ways that are harmful to competition and consumers. For example, and this is something that we've covered a bit earlier, they can engage in self-preferencing conduct, especially where the platform itself does offer competing products which are exactly the same as what their users are selling. They may also impose unfair terms and conditions on their end users, and that can also be harmful to the users. If such a shift from informal to formal e-commerce platforms is likely to occur, it is important for the Philippines as well as other countries within ASEAN to observe whether these trends may potentially be harmful to the level of competition within their markets and also ultimately to consumers. I think there is definitely a case to be made for us to continue to observe the developments that are ongoing in other jurisdictions, especially in the context of ex-ante regulations, to see whether these trends are something which each of us within the ASEAN community should be considering and embracing to prepare ourselves to deal with the challenges that come up from the e-commerce economy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Xu Ming. Let me jump to Mr. Yun. Mr. Yun, I just want to continue on the discussion on the roles of MSMEs in the country, particularly South Korea. How do you deal with this kind of development, the rapid growth in the digital economy? What is the status of MSMEs in South Korea? Can you share with us?
Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to participate in the 9th ASEAN competition conference. Okay, Korea has about 99.9% MSMEs, 7 million firms in terms of number of firms. With the rapid growth of online platforms, concerns are rising over abusing their superior bargaining power against MSMEs in Korea. There are emerging issues regarding platforms' unfair trade practices against online stores, especially MSMEs, such as non-transparent contract terms and growing burden of service fees on stores. In response, the KFTC is promoting to enact new legislation that enhances fairness and transparency in transactions between online platforms and stores while preventing and resolving disputes. The purpose of the legislation is to specify important matters that must be included in the contract, like product exposure methods, and prevent damages resulting from unilateral contract changes and termination. In addition, we plan to distribute standard contracts of e-commerce platforms and strengthen mediation by establishing the Dispute Mediation Committee specialized in this field. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Yun. I would like to go back, Mr. Shuming. I just came to my mind, when we are talking about strengthening mediation by establishing the Dispute Mediation Committee, in South Korea, and then, on how they promote the enforce new legislation. When we go into algorithms, AI, big data, and super apps, it shows that how digital economy has evolved through innovations, which is good for the business and the economy. But how does Singapore? I know there's an agreement here. Ex ante approach is a must in a way, in some ways, yeah. But how do you deal? In there are many ways, I presume. But can you share in specific on how Singapore look at this super app algorithm and AI and other things?
Well, I think that the creation of super apps does create certain economies of scale for market players. But at the same time, it also does create competition concerns because they do allow for cross-leveraging across different market segments, and therefore allowing the one party to basically exercise its power in one market across to another market in order to gain market share. And you see this super app as basically part of a wider attempt by businesses to create ecosystems for themselves. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. Indeed, from some users would also give you the feedback that having a good product ecosystem certainly is advantageous to them from a user experience perspective. But like I said earlier, creation of these kinds of super apps do therefore have the ability to then entrench users within the ecosystem, especially if you look at concerns about user inertia. So I think the developments that we are seeing right now are essentially trying to establish certain baseline behavior that governments as well as regulators would expect of players within the market without having to essentially grapple with some of the other challenges that we would see in terms of ex post enforcement. Typically, in an ex post enforcement regime, you will need to basically establish, for example, market dominance. You may need to then go into issues of what is the market definition, whether or not there is countervailing buyer power, and all these other considerations, which then help to determine if or whether or not the market player actually does exhibit dominance within the market. And that, as Mr. Sims has already pointed out, does lead to its own fair share of problems because the process in determining that is sometimes fraught with uncertainty. And ultimately, even if you're able to prevail at the end of the day, it does take a while before you get a decision which will then impact one player as opposed to impacting multiple players. So we see the developments that are going on overseas as an attempt to essentially put aside some of these challenges that are faced in the ex post enforcement regimes to look at what could be common baseline behaviors which we would expect of certain large digital platforms and be able to impose some of these behavioral changes without having to grapple too much with economic theory, but rather determine the imposition of these baseline behaviors based on certain objective criteria such as the reach, consumer reach, annual turnover, and the like, which are probably subject to less uncertainty in terms of enforcement. So that's the trend that we are seeing, and it's something that we are continuing to basically evaluate, and we will definitely be also at the same time looking at our current ex post enforcement tools to see whether they continue to make sense and whether or not they need to be enhanced. Because even though there is a push to move towards ex ante interventions, I do think that our current ex post enforcement tools will continue to play a certain role, especially in the context within the competition regulators toolkit. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Xiuming. I would like to go back to Mr. Yoon before we go to Professor Clark. Yeah. Okay. Mr. Xiuming just now he mentioned about ex post enforcement, and then he elaborated on super app, and then and as you can see, for the past few years, I think a couple of years, I think about 4 countries have taken action against Grab and Uber for their merger, Mr. Yoon. Yes. And then basically, the lesson learned here is the removal of potential competitors or the acquisition of existing competitors in digital market. I mean, somehow showed us that can lead to reduction in competition and innovation. From the perspective of KFTC, what are the best strategy to combat this issue, Mr. Yoon?
Thank you. The Grab and Uber M&A case reviewed by the Philippine Competition Authority shows that digital platforms create complex and diverse issues that could not be easily seen in the traditional industries. There are concerns that major platforms which have dominated the markets are blocking the entry of their competitors or expanding their power to related markets. And such concerns are gaining ground. Major platforms are absorbing their potential competitors through killer acquisitions, thereby solidifying the monopolistic structure. In response, the Korea Fair Trade Commission introduced notification requirements for M&As based on transaction value, like the Germany, with a view to monitoring killer acquisitions. Also, we will continue to seek better systems in reviewing vertical or horizontal M&As of platforms through active research. Moreover, we are studying emerging issues regarding the digital economy and competitive harm. And based on that research, we'll come up with a coping mechanism to tackle these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yoon. Yes, let's go now to Professor Clark. Yeah, Professor, you have heard all the comments, and you have seen the presentation by Mr. Guyap and Mr. Rapal. Okay, so tell us, share with us what conclusion that you can derive from the lessons and the points that we have discussed just now.
Well, thank you, and I also want to thank Maria and Abraham as well for their thought-provoking paper. I think before looking at the conclusions, just perhaps draw out some of the key themes that came both from the paper and from some of the discussions that have already been had. First, obviously, that there's been a rapid spike in the growth of e-commerce and the platforms that support it, and that's likely not to be temporary, but an enduring change, particularly so with MSMEs. And I think the authors described this quite appropriately as a watershed moment for e-commerce in the Philippines, and that's obviously not restricted to the Philippines, but around the region as well and the world. Second, I think also the paper and the comments have highlighted an uneven impact of the shift towards digital economy on different sectors and businesses, and the concern that the entrenching of dominance in some of the digital platforms and their essentiality might cause problems for those sectors that perhaps missed out moving forward. Some of that unevenness obviously is just the stuff of competition. Some people responded better than others, and those that do that normally succeed in market economies, and that's normally a good thing. But at the same time, the speed and extent of the growth and the different market structures that's produced does cause an increased and a novel, I think, risk of exploitation and exclusion that perhaps hasn't been the case with different sorts of markets in the past. I think also, and we just heard commentary on this, the paper exposed limits even of certain ex-ante behavioural remedies in merger cases in particular, particularly by reference to grab and so on. Obviously, there were commitments in that case, and while they predated COVID, the pandemic supercharged, I think, the potential negative effects of allowing mergers where there's uncertainty about whether they'll become critical competitors in the future. And finally, I think the paper recognised the risk to competition from the rapid shift towards the digital economy wasn't unique to the Philippines or the region, as I've already mentioned, even though there might be substantially different underlying market structures and consumer preferences. So the significant changes and challenges of the sort of digital market era has forced a global reckoning in this respect, and we can learn a great deal from what's happening elsewhere. We don't have to start afresh. So just briefly coming back perhaps to the conclusions drawn from all of this, I think it's first that the large digital gatekeepers, while they've facilitated e-commerce and produced a range of significant other benefits during this fairly unique moment, have, by virtue now of their global size and gatekeeper role, at least the potential to exclude and exploit the small businesses engaged in e-commerce with flow-on effects to consumers. And second, that the traditional tools that we're used to using may not be capable of addressing all of the concerns they present. They may work sometimes, but they may not deal with all of these challenges. Third, that the entrenched dominance and power of these hegemonic platforms in the digital era may require modification to competition tools as a result. They may require also that introduction of ex-ante intervention, whether we call it regulation or otherwise, as well as, importantly, and this was highlighted by Mr. Sims in particular, a broader cooperation than perhaps has ever been needed previously between other authorities, given that the effects are not restricted. They might be caused by some competition and dominance concerns, but certainly not restricted to competition and their effects. And finally, again, that there's just so much to learn from the market studies that have already been conducted in ensuring that any action that is taken to change or increase enforcement interventions strikes the right balance between the benefits and opportunities afforded by these platforms while still safeguarding innovation, competition and consumer interest.
Thank you so much, Professor Clark. Yes, so ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. We have heard very extensive and useful and also relevant commentaries from our distinguished commentators. But let us delve deep a bit more into their country experiences, because I think it's vital for the ASEAN economies to learn as much as possible from the established economy. I have, just for everybody's information, I have came across research done by Bain and Company that track the progress of platform economy in Southeast Asia, 6 biggest economies, namely Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. It recognizes the challenges that competition, there are challenges in terms of competition, consumer protection, future of work, and digital divide. Mr. Sims, yes, as you know, as we all know, Australia has recently published a report on digital advertising services inquiry, which has found that Google dominance harm businesses and consumers. What are some issues that ACCC has identified in these studies, and what measures do you think that may be necessary to address them? Mr. Sims.
Thank you. Look, what a fascinating question. And I have to say, I could actually spend the next 3 hours on that topic, but I'll try and do it in a few minutes. Look, it is fascinating. We have done deep dives into ad tech apps, search, and a range of other things. I think in ad tech, you've got Google dominating the ad tech supply chain. There's basically 4 bits of the supply chain that you need to be in to provide an ad tech service. Google has between 60 and 90% market share. There's various ways to define it, sometimes more, sometimes less, but very strong position, and the only one with strong positions in each of those parts of the supply chain. That, of course, means there's a fundamental conflict of interest when you get involved in the ad tech market. For example, the advertiser wants to get the largest advertising for their spend. The person who owns the website wants to get the most money for their space. There's a conflict. But Google is often representing both sides without any rules of how they deal with that. Secondly, because of their essential position, there's been innovations tried that would have helped the publishers, the owner of the websites, to get more money for their ads. Google closed that off. They often had a last look on all transactions, which they don't do anymore, but they had it for a while. They self-preference in the sense that if you use one part of the system, the only way to use another part is through a Google part of the system. If you want to advertise on YouTube, you can only do it through Google. So there's a lot of that going on, and they take about a 30% fee, which is, I think, quite significant. In the apps market, a lot of self-preferencing again. That is Apple apps being promoted at the expense of other apps. And obviously we've got the Spotify case in Europe, but there's many other allegations out there. You've got the having to use the Apple and Google payment systems. I mean, with Apple, for example, they won't even let the app developers tell their users that they could get the app if they went on the app developer's website. So it's extremely restrictive, and you must use Apple's payment system. And then, of course, you've got, again, issues of quite high fees being taken out. On search, and I think the other bit with that, with the apps market, is I think there's a real concern over innovation, given the complete control that both Google and Apple have over app stores, and the constraints they place. And of course, the fact that there's self-preferencing going on makes it hard for innovative developers to get their product to market. And then in search, Google is obviously paying very large sums of money to Apple to be the default search engine. They're paying a lot of money to other OEM equipment manufacturers to do the same. In Australia, they have about a 94% share. The concern is that other business models that might offer customers different propositions find it hard to get established. So I put all that at its harshest and probably left out a bit of nuance just to work within the time constraints we've got here. But I think there are concerns. I mean, these various things I've described, search, apps, ad tech, they just dominate our economy. And so the concerns there are important for our economy. To answer your final question, we are looking to see whether some upfront ex-ante enforcement rules or regulation, whatever you call it, but there is a big debate about that. But it means clear rules about what you can and can't do to promote competition and innovation, and we'll be looking to do that in 2022.
Yes. You see, you have also touched on data-driven innovation. Basically, we have to agree that data-driven innovation, it will benefit consumers, and then somehow will aid in the recovery of economies. Yeah, but there are risks. Yeah, Mr. Sim, that poses to consumers and businesses. Do you think you can elaborate on that, on how the competition authorities can we call that monitor and remain vigilant on this factor?
Look, I think the data issues are very important. I think they're important for competition enforcers, they're important for consumer agencies, and they're important for privacy agencies. And as I said before, the best outcome here is going to be if those agencies work together. If they narrow their focus too much, they won't achieve the success that's needed. Data is increasingly more and more going to dominate our economies. It already is. We benefit from Google Maps, Google Search, comparison services. Data promotes competition. In Australia, we've got a consumer data right as a competition initiative. Obviously, it helps online commerce. But the risks are real and need to be dealt with. To protect consumers and small businesses, but also to make sure we get the best use of data and we don't get a backlash that sees us not get the benefits of data. I mean, the harms are, I think, many. Obviously, there's harms to privacy, which is each individual participating in this conference has a different view on privacy. Some treat it very seriously, others couldn't care less, but there's clearly a privacy issue. There's issues such as dynamic pricing, which again gets much debate. That is trying to work out the maximum price you can sell to each individual, which I think is a transfer away from consumer surplus towards producer surplus. You've got the fact that data is a source of competitive advantage and a source of entry barriers. And obviously, Google has a lot of data, so do other digital platforms. Google's trying to remove third-party cookies from its ecosystem, trying to therefore make sure that it has a stronger position in data than other entities. We're seeing Apple do various things in this sphere as well. So trying to capture and build entry barriers by data is going to be a very big issue. And also you've got various dark patterns that can be used with data. And I think here is something we really need to be aware of. Bombarding a consumer at their point of vulnerability, bombarding consumers and saying you've got to buy now, otherwise the price will change. We've even seen behaviours where online retailers put things in your cart that you didn't put in there. So a whole lot of, yes, I know I enjoyed that one as well, but there's a whole lot of, I mean, that's fraud, I know, but it is something captured by consumer law and needs to be. So, and look, for businesses, they need to be careful, because if you build your business on a platform, the platform changes the algorithm, you can be out of business and you have no recourse whatsoever. And the other point with businesses is, because you're working in a constrained world over which you have limited control, it can damage innovation. So I think data offers tremendous promise to our society, but it does pose risks. And I think competition regulators or enforcers, consumer enforcers, privacy entities have got to work together to deal with this, and they need to work together both nationally and internationally.
I think listening from you, I think Malaysia has, MyCC, we have to start talking to our, privacy agency, data privacy agency after this. Okay, Mr. Shuming, CCCS has developed also market study on e-commerce, similar to Australia. Yeah. Could you share with us, the details, and maybe you can summarize it? I mean, I'm sure that all of us can learn a lot from your market study.
Yes, thank you. We have continued to monitor key developments in the digital market and to review how our competition framework ensures that they remain relevant and robust to tackle competition and consumer harm in the market. As I mentioned earlier, in 2020, we did embark on an e-commerce platform study. And I think the upshot of that study was, at least in the Singapore context, we didn't find any major competition concerns as yet, simply because the markets were quite contestable. There were a number of e-commerce platforms that were competing actively against each other, and that did result in some degree of consumer benefits. But we did also assess in that process that further guidance and clarity could be provided to businesses on how a competition regulator like CCCS may assess competition cases involving digital platforms. To that end, what we did was we are in the process of amending our competition guidelines to provide a bit more clarity on various matters. For example, how we assess market definition in the context of multi-sided platforms, how we may assess abuse of dominance in the context of digital platforms, including our position on newer theories of harm such as self-referencing behavior, and last but not least, how we may assess mergers and acquisitions where one or more firms are important innovators that may change competition dynamics even if they do not as yet have a large market share. Arising from that market study, we also engaged with a number of major e-commerce players within the Singapore market to develop an infographic containing good trade practices which sellers on these platforms should try to adhere to. And we've gotten the commitment from these e-commerce platforms to actually cascade some of these good practices down to the individual sellers. I suppose the COVID-19 pandemic has also basically seen a sharp increase in online shopping. And what we have also done is we've worked with the Consumers Association of Singapore to provide an advisory to consumers on certain risks that may come across in online transactions. So, for instance, you would see some of these suppliers essentially setting up websites that look like Singapore websites to give the Singapore consumers the impression that they're dealing with a party that is located in Singapore, using, for example, the SG prefix in the name of the website. You might also see some of these suppliers tending to prefer collection of monies upfront before the goods are eventually delivered to the consumer. And that creates a problem, especially when you have false or misleading representations about the quality of the product that is given. And by the time the consumer does receive the product and realizes that that is not something that matches the description, the money has been paid and it may very well be too late, especially if the entity is not based in within the jurisdiction itself. I think finally, arising from the digital platform study, we also recognize that data portability can provide a well-functioning digital economy in Singapore. And to that end, and picking up on Mr. Sim's point, we did collaborate with our Personal Data Protection Commission to publish a paper on the impact and benefits of data portability requirements in terms of business innovation, market competition, and consumer welfare. The data portability requirement has in fact been introduced through amendments to our Personal Data Protection Act. Essentially, we tried to strike a balance where there is no mandatory requirements for data portability simply because forcing it down on the businesses may not necessarily respect the personal rights of the individuals concerned. But rather what we have done is we created a right on the part of the individual to request the business actually transfer the individual's personal data in a machine readable format over to some other undertaking or commercial entity. These amendments have been made, although at the time of me speaking on this panel, they haven't come into force just yet because the regulations are still being worked out. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Shuming. Talking about amendments, MICC has been passed by our government to review our competition law in order to address the digital economy issues. Maybe next year we will come to Singapore, yeah, and learn from something from you. Okay. Anyhow, Mr. Yun, yes. Okay, Mr. Yun, we have seen some enforcement action by KFTC. Recently, KFTC has fined Google for blocking entry of rival operating system and development of new smart devices. Can you share with us the progress of the case and then how KFTC deal with the current issues on digital economy in relation to the case?
Okay, thank you. The KFTC is taking a balanced approach to digital issues. We are keeping the innovation momentum while preventing negative effects. In so doing, we can work on the path toward the sound growth of the digital economy. To achieve our goals, the KFTC newly launched an ICT task force, which takes charge of the ICT sector. The task force will keep close watch on anti-competitive practices of platforms. Along with the enforcement, the KFTC is carrying out the sector inquiry to closely monitor the trade and competition in major digital markets, such as app stores and online advertising. We are also pursuing institutional reform in consideration of the characteristics of the digital economy and identifying and handling issues regarding competition laws. With regard to unilateral conduct by online platforms, we plan to provide criteria to judge illegality, such as market definition and market dominance, reflecting the unique characteristics of the digital market. In addition, the KFTC is pushing ahead with establishment and amendment of laws and regulations to lay the regulatory foundation for transparent and fair trade, both between platforms and online stores, and between platforms and consumers. The KFTC is laying the legal foundation to tackle these issues. So we'd like to firmly secure the legal framework to boost the fairness and transparency in the trade between platforms and stores by establishing the Online Platform Fairness Act. Along with this, we'd like to secure consumer safety and choice in online transactions while holding platforms accountable for their market power by amending the Korea E-Commerce Act. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Yun. Professor Clark, I would like to jump. You heard how HOC have, they have strategized on how to tackle this issue, and then, you just heard Mr. Yun said, they're amending the law, and then they have, find some parties along the line, and CCC, they conducted market studies, at the same time they amended their law also. Okay, so what do you think, with these current methods? Do you think is sufficient? Is there limitation to all these actions that have been taken by all these agencies?
Classic Zoom error. I think the discussions generally reveal that while different approaches are obviously being taken, the same questions are being asked and the same concerns are being identified, and that all constitute a reasonable response, perhaps taking into account regional subtleties as well, to what is a genuine concern that I think that the commentators have identified quite reasonably the benefits I think we've all enjoyed having these platforms, particularly in these last 2 years, and not just the platforms, other entities in the digital markets that have helped really support us to a great deal during these last 2 years. But the power creates all sorts of incentives for them to exploit that power. I think what's also been revealed in the discussions is a genuine caution against intervention that isn't well considered, particularly in terms of what the unintended consequences might be. And so I think there's been it's been clear in the discussion that there's been a keenness to perhaps intervene differently, an acceptance that there might be limitations on existing competition laws, ex-ante intervention or other guidelines might be needed to address that, but that ought to be very much driven by market studies and a deep understanding of what it is you're trying to correct for and what the potential consequences might be of interfering in a particular way. And so I think that the last example given of data portability, for example, and this is a consideration in Australia as well, around giving rights to individuals and not thinking, well, we just make corporations do it because that might have privacy and other implications on parties. Demonstrates the, I think, deeper thinking now that's going into the consequences of possible more direct intervention in these markets. So I think it's a net positive. I think there's lots to learn from it. There's lots of commonality in it. But I think that all of the discussions so far have demonstrated this commitment to a sort of a research-led approach to determining what's appropriate within each jurisdiction.
Thank you so much, Professor Clark. I have one type of something like pop quiz type of question for Mr. Sims. We are talking about, while we are talking, discussing on these issues, it all boils down to consumer protection. Yeah. So we are so worried about the consumer, how they want to deal with it, and how we want to protect them and whatnot. But what do you think the role of consumers here is in this digital economy era? How do they should help the agencies in in enforcing the law and at the same time protecting their interests? Do you have anything to say to the consumers? Some consumers, they take it for granted and they left it alone. Everything to the agencies to deal with. How about their rules?
Look, a very good question. I think firstly, we have to understand that the essence of consumer law, and I know this is a competition conference, but the essence of consumer law is don't mislead consumers. So it's not about price gouging, it's about don't mislead consumers. And I think consumers are often misled. We've done surveys here that show, we've asked consumers, what would you think if this and this and this happened on the web and you were tracked in these ways and you were profiled in these ways? And we had a very high proportion of consumers say, well, that would be terrible. We don't want that to happen. Yet that is precisely what is happening. So I think there is a big gap between what consumers think is happening and what is happening. And unless they're well informed, they can't make choice. And that, of course, is the essence of a competitive market. I think the other issue is that, consumers, if they're thinking about, which app to use, which search engine to use, their choices are very limited at the moment. So I actually think the onus is on competition enforcers, competition agencies, working with consumer agencies, privacy agencies, to make things more transparent, to allow more competition, make sure consumers are well informed. I think that is really our job. If we do our job well and there are still problems, well, there's no more we can do. We can only do so much, and consumers ultimately have got to be responsible for their own outcomes. But at the moment, I don't think consumers get the information they need. I don't think they're allowed to have the choices. For example, in Australia, and I'll finish on this, I wonder how many consumers really understand the privacy implications of Google search, how much they might prefer DuckDuckGo, which protects your privacy. The difference between the search engines is not as large as some would have you think. So I just think at the moment consumers aren't equipped to make the decisions because of all the problems we've discussed today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Sims. Okay, Mr. Shuming, I just want to go back on one topic. I think I forgot to touch on this. As you know, we are in the same boat. We together with ASEAN in developing the investigation manual on competition policy and laws on for the digital economy. I think. Do you think you can share with us, the works that are being carried out now by ASEAN in this matter.
Yeah, I think that the development of the manual on competition law and policy in the digital economy is going to be one of the key deliverables for ASEAN for the coming year. I think the intent really, and this is something, it goes towards a certain amount of a reasonable or fair attempt on our part to achieve some degree of harmonization across the different ASEAN states. The manual will basically help to gather together a list of pointers that competition authorities can consider and should consider in the context of investigating various cases involving any of the three main types of anti-competitive behavior, be it anti-competitive agreements, abuse of dominance, or even mergers. Really, it's meant to collate together certain points that should be taken into account and that competition authorities can then therefore take reference to either as a basis to evaluate how they would conduct their enforcement in a particular case, or whether there is actually some benefit to perhaps making amendments subsequently to their laws. So the hope through this process is really we may not be able to achieve 100% harmonization across different ASEAN states, bearing in mind that certainly there's going to be differences based on each of our own local experiences. But to have a common language, to have a common list of areas and a common understanding of what the concerns may be, will go towards helping to have ASEAN states basically raising awareness and at the same time collaborating together on enforcement issues.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shu Ming, on elaborating on the development of that manual. Mr. Yoon, I'm about to wrap up the discussion before we go to Q&A session for this panel. Do you have any last word before we go into Q&A? Maybe you can talk about how online platform exert the influence on how to regulate the market. Do you think you have any thoughts on that?
Thank you. In many cases, online platforms exert a big influence to regulate the way market participants communicate with each other, operate their businesses worldwide, and implement the same policy and services. We believe that it is important to find the desirable regulatory methods in both policies and cases and execute consistently through global collaboration. Taking the newly emerging issues of the digital economy alone would never be easy. Yet, we believe transnational communication and cooperation will lead us to wider solutions. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Yun. Professor Clark, do you have anything to add before we go to Q&A?
I'm happy to go to Q&A to allow some more time for that discussion, unless there's anything you'd like me to cover.
Yeah, no, it's just that share some maybe extra tips that you can give, especially to the ASEAN members agencies. Many of us we are still new in competition enforcement, more so in digital economy. Yeah, so yeah.
Look, I mean, I think much of this has already been covered. I think perhaps the first point is simply that there are limits to competition laws, even if they can be adapted. And I think there are definitely different camps suggesting that existing laws do the job versus there's a need for fairly serious change. And what I would draw on there are comments made by Mr. Sims earlier as well. I think that although I think that there's a chance that your unilateral rules might be able to adapt lots of conversations are happening about developing new theories of harm or developing old theories of harm to allow them to be conceptualized for these mega conglomerates, sort of multi-sided markets. That takes time to develop the consensus for that to be effective in a litigation process, so as not to narrow down the scope Rod was talking about earlier. But second, that they're fairly ineffective at dealing with dynamic markets in terms of remedies. Constructing a remedy that's effective and targeted to the harm is difficult, and it happens 5 or 10 years later, which is an eternity in the context of digital markets. And so simply not good tools, the substantive prohibitions for abusive power type conduct that we might be concerned with digital platforms. There are also, I think, and this is relevant to all investigatory, all enforcement agencies, significantly more challenges to investigating harm in digital markets if you are going to pursue substantive enforcement. And again, these have been highlighted in some of the comments, and we've seen attention drawn to digital units within competition agencies that are able to understand these markets, perhaps able to identify harm, try and get a better understanding of how algorithms might work beneficially or harmfully, and so on, to help support that enforcement. Now, if those units and that experience doesn't exist to bring action, it's going to be particularly difficult to bring ex post enforcement action in relation to digital markets. So I think there is a need for some ex ante rules, regulations, whatever we want to call them. I would just say on that point two things. So one of the themes has also been a concern about not to limit innovation. And I think that while there's often discussion about the risks of having ex ante rules and greater intervention on innovation, I think there's less attention given. There is among this audience, which is perhaps more enforcement authorities, but there's less attention given to the fact that doing nothing is also a decision, and that it risks innovation and harming the startups and other innovators that might otherwise break into the markets, and that requires serious consideration. First, in relation to mergers. So I know the ACCC has an agenda in relation to mergers here, and a belief that the existing regime is not effective when it comes to mergers, particularly of small startups in the digital space. So I think that we've seen many enforcement agencies around the world giving consideration to how merger laws might change, either to reverse onuses of proof or to have particular rules in relation to certain industries. I think there's a lot said about not wanting to, again, stop the innovation and benefits that might come from the acquisition of these startups, but again, not as much, perhaps a growing amount of concern about the stifling of innovation that might come from snapping them up. I think from an enforcement perspective, it's virtually impossible under most current merger rules to prove to a satisfactory degree in an administrative or judicial enforcement process that a certain acquisition will cause harm, because the market's so dynamic and the merger's typically happening in the infancy of the startup companies. So I think I would suggest a braveness about accepting type 1 or accepting more type 2 errors in merger cases. It's probably not going to be the end of the world to allow that to happen. It's simply a choice that agencies need to be making, and then develop tools around that to avoid it perhaps going too far. I would just two more quick points. Breakups are often talked about. I would say opposed to that. It sounds like an easy solution. It's obviously, for the most part, not possible by most agencies when we're talking about global giants, but even with more localised ones, there's probably not a whole lot to be gained, and the benefits of efficiencies tend to be lost. But it's a popular political talking point, I think, at the moment, at least with some of the larger companies. And that ex ante rules, or the problem is, perhaps I understand the reluctance to use the term regulation, because it's sort of very much frowned upon in the competition community as well, there being an assumption that it's likely to be undue and result in over-enforcement. But for the reasons already canvassed, it can provide a corrective mechanism or a set of rules that are both certain for business, because ex post rules are clearly uncertain and difficult to predict, particularly for smaller businesses and how they might go about using them. And ex ante rules simply set the rules we're prepared to accept in the market, particularly when there's likely privacy, consumer, small business harms that we can clearly foresee and address upfront. without necessarily posing a problem for innovation. So that's all I'll say at this point. Hopefully, allowing questions, time for Q&A.
Yeah, we do have time. Thank you so much, Professor Clark, for your wisdom. Okay, yeah. We have around 7 questions. Shall we go to the first one? How coordinated should ASEAN regulators be in addressing digital economy issues given its cross-border nature, or how harmonized should regulations be? Mr. Sims, I just can't get enough of your wisdom. Please, can you answer these questions? Yeah, the first question.
You're very kind, Mr. Ismail, very kind. Look, I think ASEAN has a fantastic history of cooperation. It's a very strong grouping. I think it's ideally placed to have a great level of cooperation. The manual was mentioned earlier. I think that's going to be really important if everyone can contribute to that, and it can just be a great vehicle for everybody. So I think sharing lessons, sharing what the issues are, sharing information, and to the extent action is taken, harmonising that as best you can. I mean, obviously, there's been work on, for example, food delivery in a number of the ASEAN countries, but when work is done in one area, sharing it with other areas, I just think it's fundamental. I'd also add that I think it's important for ASEAN to have clear links to overseas agencies. Obviously, Australia is extremely keen to work very closely with the ASEAN countries, and we already do. We've got a lot of information we can pass on, and I'm sure other agencies do as well. So very close cooperation, and I think as much harmonisation as possible. Not always possible, but as much as you can achieve. I think ASEAN is in a unique place to really show what cross-border cooperation can do in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sims. Okay, Mr. Yun, somebody posed a question to you, Mr. Yun. They want to know, how does the KFTC coordinate with other competition agency addressing cross-border cases in the digital economy? I would like to know also, because the thing is, as you know, digital economy is a borderless economy. I mean, things can happen somewhere, at the corner of somewhere in the world, but somehow the transaction takes place in Korea and Malaysia at the same time. So how do you go about it?
Okay, thank you. The KFTC is a kind of the informal networks with the foreign competition authorities. So when there's the case which the other countries are involved, we have a kind of consultation with the other foreign competition authorities personnel. Even in the when in case of the international cartel, we may have a kind of the coordinated raise to the suspect. So what I want to say is that we have the informal networks, and we have a consultation meeting with the related foreign competition authorities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yun. Okay, let me go back to our presenters, Maria and Abraham. Yeah, that's one question for you both. The question is, what are the limitations for MSMEs in Philippines in terms of e-commerce market? Do you think you can elaborate more, especially with regards to the informal economy? Because as you can see in Singapore, informal economy is relatively small part of the digital economy itself. Do you think you can elaborate a bit on this?
So, with respect to the informal economy and digital platforms, to be able to capitalize on these platforms, at least in the Philippines, there's often a certain degree of accreditation you need to be able to satisfy. So, you need to be able to satisfy permitting requirements or have the ability to issue official receipts if you really want to have full featured online presence. And the key advantage that confers is you can capitalize on the payment infrastructure and even financial technology such as buy now, pay later schemes, as well as taking advantage of the small parcel logistics infrastructure of these platforms. For informal economy players, they will normally post not on dedicated e commerce sites but social media sites, which do not offer them payment system functionality and which generally will not provide them access to small parcel logistics. So they'd have to would provide a workaround for their own transactions. So the key challenge really is how we can migrate the people from this informal sector to the formal sector so that they too can capitalize on the payment system and infrastructure systems that the platforms can provide.
Thank you so much. Ms. Rapal, do you have anything to add?
Yes, maybe just on the dispute resolution portion. I guess since it's an informal economy and then mostly based on social media, the owner of the platform basically has the monopoly or the dominant position to set guidelines for these entities to comply in. So that's something also to look into.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. There are a few questions here. There are concerns with ASEAN on how should it focus its efforts, and then how can ASEAN synergize its effort, and are there cooperation between ASEAN competition authorities to monitor competition in digital economy? Yes. I'm just because we are part of ASEAN, Malaysia, MyCC, and Mr. Xiuming, one of the leading competition agency, CCCS, in ASEAN. I think, Mr. Xiuming, we can agree that we can work it out and find a solution in the end.
Yes, I think there have been, of course, numerous exchanges between each of the agencies. I think from time to time, if we identify some conduct that is occurring in one particular ASEAN member state, it may have some impact either in Singapore or may provide some reference point for us. We've certainly been able to reach out. I think the experience on the ground has always been that there's always willing cooperation and collaboration between agencies, and that's something that we will continue to, of course, enjoy and work towards in the years to come. I think there are also other areas where we can continue to collaborate. Sometimes formalizing it through an MOU may be one possible option. But even informal cooperation has been also very rich and beneficial to each of our respective agencies. I think the challenges with digital market players is that because of the cross-border nature of their activities, the need for harmonization is going to be very important. But harmonization doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have exactly the same laws, but it does mean that you have to have some common understanding about what the theories of harm could be, and to have a common understanding also about the behavior of some of these online players. And certainly, I think a lot of us can stand to benefit from the insights that the ACCC will be gaining from its multi-year study across the digital economy. And we certainly look forward to receiving our education on that front as well.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shun. We got 2 more minutes. Last question, but it's from me, the moderator. If I may. Yeah. When Professor Clark said, she focused somehow on the enforcement, be it ex ante and post ante. Professor Clark, you seen CMA UK? They have formed digital market unit, in order to address the issue of digital economy. What is your take on this? Should the ASEAN agencies, go for the same route in this matter? Because digital economy is a very complex issue, as Mr. Sim said. Sometimes you may not have the answer on the the issues at hand. What do you think, Professor Clark? Last questions.
The last question.
Yeah,
Probably.
I promise. One last question.
Yes. I'm sure Rob would probably like to weigh into that as well. I think, look, I think where there's a great level of broad enforcement that depends upon a deep understanding of these markets, then this is essential in order to gather, to have people who know how to gather information, to look for it to help detect when there are problems in a market, or where there might be, for example, cartel activity, because you can kind of get a better understanding of how algorithms might be working, and so on. So I think, and I'm certainly not capturing all of the uses for it. I'm sure Rod could better articulate that than me. Whether or not it's a priority for ASEAN, I don't know. I think that requires some further consideration. There's lots of work done in relation. It depends on where your focus is. In relation to understanding digital markets and development of theories of harm around what they might do and so on, there's a lot of bouncing off the work of other authorities, I'm sure, that can be done in their market studies, and it may not be where the most investment is needed if you're able to leverage off that. Certainly some expertise around understanding digital markets and local impacts and so on, I think will certainly be needed, but the extent to which prioritising investment in that is needed, I think, requires perhaps some more local knowledge and consideration about where the other priorities lie. But certainly there's a great deal of learning that can be had from what the other agencies are already doing in that regard.
Thank you so much, Professor Clark. Okay, I think, ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of our panel. Thank you so much, Mr. Sim, Mr. Yoon, Mr. Shuming, and Professor Clark, and of course our winner, Ms. Rapal and Mr. Guyap. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the organizer for having us. So I leave it to Gwen. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Everybody.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you to
Ismail.
Thank you.
Thank you to our moderator, panel members, and speakers. That was a substantial discussion on the digital economy, the impact of COVID-19, and the responses to challenges, both from the perspective of competition enforcement and regulation. In particular, I really appreciate having learned about the unique situation in the jurisdictions covered, including our very own in the Philippines, and taking lessons from the experiences of the competition authorities. Congratulations once again to Attorneys Guyap and Rapal. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin the next session, I would like to invite all panel members, so from panel 3 and from panel 4, to turn on their video for a group photo.
Is it done?
Okay, I think we're done. Thank you very much, everyone, for cooperating on getting our group photo for the panels this afternoon. Thank you very much again to our moderator, panel members, and speakers from panel 3. And now we'll resume with panel 4.
Thank you.
So throughout the conference, we have learned how regional cooperation has played a critical role in addressing the current pandemic, recognizing the imperative of continued and enhanced cooperation in fostering sustainable development, and in response to the need to enhance value and supply chains, and continuing engagement with stakeholders, including the private sector. The AEGC issued a joint statement in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and intensified cooperation to ensure timely exchange of information to address anti-competitive activity. An examination of responses at the national level and their consistency across the region can only fortify the cooperation that will be as critical in addressing future crises. In our fourth and closing panel for the ninth ASEAN Competition Conference, We will delve into the means by which cooperation may be strengthened in anticipation of future crises. For our fourth panel, allow me to introduce our moderator, commentators, and speakers. Our moderator for this panel discussion is Ms. Sarah Firdaus of our ASEAN Secretariat. And to offer their respective interventions as commentators, we are grateful for the participation of our competition authorities and members of the academic community. With Mr. Deswin Noor, Head of Public Relations and Cooperation Bureau of the Indonesian Competition Commission, Dr. Arsenio M. Balistacan, Chairman of the Philippine Competition Commission, Professor Casey Lee, Senior Fellow at ICEA's Yusuf Ishak Institute, and Professor Frederick Jenny, Chairman of the OECD Competition Committee. Our speakers are Mr. Alice Kalmande, expert staff of the member of the Indonesian Parliament, and Ms. Latifa Kusuma Wardani, partner at Gafar and Co Law Firm. They will discuss lessons learned from EU and cooperation in ANSPATA framework in relation to the Indonesian Competition Law Revision and Leniency Program. I would like to invite our moderator, commentators, and speakers to take the virtual floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gwen. Sorry. Thank you very much, Gwen, and good afternoon, panelists and participants. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the fourth and final panel discussion of the day, where we will discuss the importance and the means for ASEAN to strengthen cooperation in anticipation of future crises and how regional cooperation plays a vital role in dealing with future challenges. At the recently convened ASEAN Summit in October, the leaders called for ASEAN centrality and unity to address common challenges to advance ASEAN's comprehensive recovery from COVID-19. They also noted the need for ASEAN to strengthen its capacity and institutional effectiveness to adapt to new and emerging challenges. The AGC has over the years strengthened its cooperation by way of continued sharing of best practices, undertaking joint capacity building activities, carrying out feasibility studies to find means to bridge the gaps and differences amongst member states, as well as developing regional guidelines and promoting competition to build regional awareness. However, the challenges brought about by the pandemic requires member states to do more. And so the AGC showed its commitment by way of issuing a joint statement in response to the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 in order to ensure timely exchange of information to address anti-competitive activities during the pandemic. The AGC has also engaged in negotiations of free trade agreements with competition chapters over recent years, such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is expected to take into effect by 1st of January 2022, and also the upgraded ANSPATA agreement expected to be concluded by 2022. In addition, as mentioned yesterday by the Deputy Secretary General of ASEAN, ASEAN plans to launch the negotiation for an ASEAN Framework Agreement on competition at the ASEAN Economic Ministers meeting before the end of next year in order to build the foundation to address competition cases affecting more than one jurisdiction. We are fortunate today to be joined by a panelist of exceptional speakers who will endeavor to address questions on how competition authorities should respond to the overall policy response of governments in dealing with future crises. How can governments work together to cushion the negative impacts of the current and future crises? And finally, what needs to be considered in the development of the ASEAN Information Portal on merger cases, an initiative identified under the updated ASEAN Competition Action Plan 2025. Let us begin with the first speaker for this session, Mr. Deswin Noor. He is the head of the Public Relations and Cooperation Bureau of the Indonesian Competition Commission and chair of the ASEAN Expert Group on Competition. Mr. Noor has joined the ICC for more than 18 years and leads the communication strategies as well as the domestic and international affairs of the Commission. In his previous role, he was the Director of Merger and the initiator for recent changes in Indonesia's merger regulation in 2019. Mr. Deswin, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Sarah, for the introduction. Good evening, Professor Jenny, my colleague Casey, Chairman Arsenio and Ali, and also Sarah, and also Latifa. It's good to meet all of you here in this very important conference. So, as Sarah mentioned before, yeah, we did ASEAN, AGC did have a lot of activities. Even though we are in the midst of pandemic, we are still quite active in doing our capacity in order to reduce capacity gap. And also we enter several agreement, and we want to start a new agreement actually. So basically, we are looking forward for have an enhanced cooperation within ASEAN in the future. So I don't know whether you want to ask something, Sarah, or you want me to just speak.
Yes, please proceed with the intervention, I guess, with your thoughts on how ASEAN can strengthen regional.
Okay, so if you talk about the pandemic, the current crisis was a bit different, right? Because we cannot anticipate this kind of crisis. It's quite different if we compare with the financial crisis back in 2007 or 8, or even the monetary crisis in 1998, 1999. It's quite different. We didn't able to anticipate this. So we are a bit in shock actually having this pandemic in place. So that is why we are, as a competition authority, we try to engage more with the government to assist them with their scenario. That is why we, in line with the Hanoi plan, we also want to show our solidarity and even to show our commitment through our joint statement this year, in order for us to show that competition policy and law still exists. We are still active. We want to help you. We want together to join hand with you to back from this crisis. So during in early time, that is why a lot of us competition authority try to assist the government to secure the availability of food, the availability of health equipment, and even to supervise the distribution of vaccine or some pricing. So a lot of activities that we show during this pandemic in order for us to show that competition is still alive during this time. So, but if we talk about the future crisis, we can again we cannot anticipate the future crisis, right? Probably crisis will take place again next year or 5 years or 10 years. We don't know, but what important for us now in the future, our government has already defined their own scenario or plan for recovery. So what we can do as a competition authority is that we are trying to remind them in order for government to keep balancing the short-term objective for economic recovery, because they will do a lot of things. They will think about short-term objective. They will help business to get back on the feet. They provide a lot of money to them to help them, even to pay the liabilities and many things, and even to provide them with some exclusivity. So that's short-term objective. What we as competition, we are worried that this kind of short-term objective will affect market in the future, with the stock market in the future. So that is why important for us to engage with the government to always remind them to keep balancing their short-term objective with the long-term objective of competition policy. So that's what we need to do in order to have the government engage with us. And we also understand that during this pandemic, it showed that digital markets gain its momentum. So even for competition authority, we're doing our activities digitally. We did our hearing digitally. We do it everything online, and a lot of shopper, a lot of significant increase in number of internet user for Indonesia is quite huge. So marketplace, a lot of several marketplace was established during this pandemic. So basically, this is the digital time. So market is getting borderless. So everyone can make some transactions. So this create its own challenges for us, for competition authority. So what we can do in order for us to anticipate the further crisis or future crisis in line with the government scenario, we need to strengthen our cooperation. We need to strengthen our cooperation between competition authority. So we want to remind that we need to understand that ASEAN is quite different compared to other regions. So most of the time that ASEAN, if we talk about the trade between ASEAN and intra-trade of ASEAN, the number is quite low actually compared to the trade between ASEAN and its non-ASEAN country. So if we talk about the numbers, intra-trade ASEAN is only was around 20, no more than 25% of total ASEAN trade in goods, but mostly done with extra ASEAN trading partner. So this caused that ASEAN would most likely to be the victim of a cross-border infringement. So unfair competition most likely occurs outside of ASEAN. So, but have direct impact or indirect impact to ASEAN members. Cooperation we needs to be aimed to preventing such potential impact and enforcing the law for cross-border environment in an effective way. So we need to
Desmond, I think we lost your connection. Okay, so maybe while we wait for Desmond to log back into the conference room, perhaps if we can request our, do we have Desmond? Not yet. All right, so maybe we can request, pass on the floor to our next speaker, who is Mr. Arsenio Balisacan, who is the current chairman of the Philippines Competition Commission. Before his appointment, Mr. Balisacan serves as the Socioeconomic Planning Secretary of the Philippines and concurrently the Director General of the National Economic and Development Authority. Mr. Balisacan has authored close to 100 academic and policy papers on various development issues, particularly in the Philippines and Asia. We are honored to have your presence today. Mr. Balisacan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon to all my colleagues in the region and elsewhere. Let me organize my intervention into two parts. One is focusing on COVID-19 and the responses from competition authorities, and second, the lessons that the Philippines, in particular the Philippine Competition Commission, learned from the pandemic. Okay, with respect to the first one, clearly the global experience from the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the strong interlinkage of our health and economic systems. We have also seen that strong and open cooperation among different jurisdictions is key to rational, informed, and coordinated responses to rapidly evolving and uncertain crisis situations. At the beginning of the pandemic, competition authorities quickly convened discussions, consulting one another on appropriate responses to the crisis. These have resulted in numerous useful knowledge products and reference materials that could easily be used by competition authorities, especially young jurisdictions. For example, on June 9, 2020, the ASEAN, through the ASEAN Experts Group on Competition, issued a joint statement emphasizing the fundamental role that competition must play in the region's pandemic responses and exhorting a business compliance with the competition law. Throughout the past year and a half, competition authorities have remained in contact with one another to discuss updates and developments and how they have been handling challenges in their respective jurisdictions, including policy and institutional responses to the pandemic. New questions, including practical and analytical issues, have been raised during these discussions, helping jurisdictions to adapt quickly to the evolving situation. True to the spirit of the Hanoi Plan of Action, which enjoined the government instrumentalities of ASEAN member states to enhance cooperation and encourage dialogue. These have been the fruits of ASEAN's participation in the GCR Conference 2021, ETOP, or the East Asia 2021, as well as this Asia Conference 2021, and also the ASEAN Heads of Competition Agencies meeting. Okay, so let me turn to the lessons that we learned from our own experiences as a competition authority. Throughout these exchanges with other AMS, we have learned that competition law and policy play an even more significant role in ensuring that markets remain efficient and fair for consumers and businesses during a crisis. In particular, the Philippine Competition Commission has considered and applied the lessons learned to specific circumstances in our jurisdictions. And let me focus on a few areas. First one is on competition enforcement. We learned that competition authorities can recalibrate strategies and focus enforcement resources, such as those for identifying cartels and abuses of dominance, and monitoring essential sectors to contribute to government efforts to protect struggling consumers and businesses. These essential sectors include healthcare, food, energy, telecommunications, logistics, and e-commerce. To further widen its reach, this year, the Commission has established its first regional investigation station because initially the competition committee, the PCC, is located in the capital, but clearly we need to expand our reach. Plans are afoot for us to expand this initiative in other locations throughout the country, and that is again triggered by the pandemic and the crisis that we have experienced. We have also learned that during a crisis, safeguarding competition through merger reviews or review remains a significant goal to ensure that markets remain open, contestable, and competitive in the medium and long run. Sacrificing this objective in the short run may significantly skew the playing field and result in higher prices, poor quality, and lower innovation that can persist even after the crisis. As the OECD report, which I believe Chair Frederick Jenny will expound later, thereby negatively affecting long-term productivity and economic growth. After its merger review powers were temporarily suspended for a year, the PCC regained last September its authority to conduct a motu proprio review or reviews of transactions that have transpired in the past year to determine whether or not this have led to a substantial lessening of competition. Hence, the PCC is once again able to fulfill its mandate of protecting consumers from unchecked market concentration. Lesson 3 on competition advocacy. We learned that competition advocacy must be directed toward reforms or measures that facilitate entry and greater competition in the markets for essential goods and services. For example, There's a great opportunity in streamlining regulatory processes and advocating the passage of laws or issuances that lower or remove barriers to entry and mandate pro-competition principles in the policymaking architecture. These initiatives facilitate a strong economic recovery and even improve unpre-pandemic conditions and processes. Filipino consumers and businesses have benefited from several measures recently adopted by the government to improve the regulatory environment of the Philippines telecommunication sector. For example, several government agencies with jurisdiction over this sector issued policies that clarify and streamline the regulatory processes for deploying investments and infrastructure required by the sector to improve the quality of services. Further, advocating the inclusion of pro-competitive provisions or features in recovery measures can help avoid the introduction of distortions to the competition landscape. Several bills, congressional bills that would allow greater liberalization of the retail trade, telecommunications, and transport sectors, among others, have progressed in the country's legislative process. The entry of more foreign investment can aid the economic recovery by facilitating the generation of more jobs and transfer of technology, as well as by increasing productivity due to greater competition. The PCC has supported these regulatory initiatives. In fact, even before the pandemic struck, we have been quite active in our competition advocacy efforts, which include providing pro-competition inputs to policy proposals of sector regulators and the legislature. Let me talk next on this competitive neutrality and the national competition policy, which we have focused on in the last year and a half. The Philippines Medium-Term Plan, Development Plan, which was crafted a few years ago, included the formulation of a national competition policy or NCP. That was the first time in our history that such a policy was included in a development plan. The Philippine government recognizes that competition principles, through a whole-of-government approach, must underpin policy strategies to restore market efficiency, avoid competition distortions, and protect consumers and micro and small medium enterprises during the pandemic and in the process of economic recovery. The country's medium-term plan, covering the 2017 to 2022 period, identifies market distortions arising from subsidized government-owned monopolies and state-owned enterprises, which compete with the private sector. The 2018 World Bank report identifies issues on competitive neutrality in the form of elements of public ownership as contributing to the country's comparatively high level of restrictiveness. We have used this report quite extensively on our advocacy work. Related to this, the PCC, together with the National Economic and Development Authority, or NEDA, issued a joint memorandum circular on the national competition policy in July of 2020. Subsequently, on 21 October this year, our president promulgated an administrative order that directly mandates national government agencies, local government units, and state-owned enterprises to comply with this policy. The order requires agencies to first review the mandates of state-owned enterprises or SOEs and recommend actions, including structural measures, to address anti-competitive behavior related to these mandates. Second, recommend the separation of proprietary and regulatory activities of SOEs. Third, assess, monitor, and establish guidelines for existing subsidies and future subsidies and state support. And fourth, implement measures to neutralize existing distortions due to public ownership. Presently, the PCC and our planning agency, NEDA, are jointly crafting a monitoring framework and comprehensive implementation strategy for the NCP, in which we are asking World Bank, ADB, and even OECD for assistance. Okay, let me turn to the importance of the international cooperation in our work. We learned that strong international cooperation in establishing coordination mechanisms facilitates more appropriate, timely, and well-conceived policy responses in the event of crisis. Particularly for the review of cross-border merger transactions, which also was covered by my colleague Nor, there is a need to establish information sharing mechanisms that enable competition jurisdictions in the ASEAN to, first, exchange information on case facts, second, consult on timelines and analytical considerations for case assessment, and third, benchmark possible competition remedies or strategies moving forward. Cooperation mechanisms with more mature jurisdictions can also assist young jurisdictions that need quick access to advisors experienced in highly specific issues in competition law and policies, for example, the digital economy. The initiatives of the AEGC to develop an ASEAN information portal on merger cases is a critical step towards this objective, and one that will largely benefit from the enforcement cooperation experience and best practices within established international forums, such as the EU and the International Cooperation Network, or ICN. Recognizing the importance of international cooperation, the PCC has recently conducted knowledge sharing sessions with the Malaysian Competition Commission and the Cambodian Consumer Protection Competition and Fraud Repression Directorate General. Among others, these sessions discuss the elements of a merger control regime and the challenges confronting a young competition agency. On this note, we are delighted to hear, hopefully later in this panel, Ali Salamande and Latifa Ardani and Indonesia's efforts to introduce further reforms in their competition law through the inclusion of a leniency program in the proposed amendment. I am pleased to note that the PCC also launched its own leniency program 2 years ago. We welcome the possibility of collaborating with our ICC colleagues and this mutual pursuit to enhance awareness and effectively implement this program among our stakeholders in the business community. Successful application of the program can ensure greater efficiency of enforcement efforts to protect consumer welfare in these areas or in these times. These collaborations are but a few of the examples of how strengthening cooperation among ASEAN member states may help in cushioning the adverse effects of current and future crises. Let me stop here, and I look forward to further discussing related issues during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arsenio Balisacan, for your intervention and for outlining the PCC's efforts in dealing with the crisis, and also highlighting the importance of international cooperation, particularly the AGC's work in the near future. Perhaps I would like to go back to Pat Deswen to give him the floor to finish his intervention. Apologies, Mr. Deswen, that you got cut earlier, but perhaps if you would like to take the floor to finish your intervention before we move on to the next speaker.
Yeah, this is, again, digital, right? Our life was depend on Wi-Fi. So thank you for having the opportunity to continue. So back to my earlier statement that ASEAN is more of a victim of anti-competitive violation outside of ASEAN. So that is why we need to cooperate stronger. And we understand that ASEAN still have a lot of challenges remain, like difference in legal system, legal framework, different institutional setting, and also different in capacity or experiences and resource. So that's why. But I think this is getting well now. We are able to start to deal with it because we have a lot of activities under AGC with the assist from our dialogue partner. Several significant deliverables was something like study on commonalities. This is where we try to understand our commonalities and also differences in order for us to find what is the best way for us to cooperate, in which area that we can cooperate. And also we have the recommended procedure for enforcement. So for exchange information, this is also good for us because we will know how to cooperate and exchange our information. Also, we have the regional cooperation framework and capacity building roadmap. Along the way, we believe we are getting better with the use of this list of activities, but we still need to improve. Cooperation in competition policy and law in ASEAN need to be tested by experience. I believe now we don't have a lot of discussion or dialogue among authorities with regard to handling cases. Number of discussion or exchange of actual cases are quite limited, even both on the internal process or after decision. So discussions we understand that we have some discussion on Grab Uber case, and in Indonesia we also have some discussion on spare part case. And Philippines we have cases with regard to cargo cases and merger cases. So this is bilateral, but we still number is still limited. We need to experience more, to talk more, to dialogue, have some lot of dialogue, more dialogue, so that we can experience where our challenge will be, what our cooperation will be, what we need to adjust, how we will need to deal with it. So a lot of experience. We need to experience this cooperation. We have the ASEAN competition and forces of work, the ASEAN we call it, but it seems this is not well maintained and seems not to be effective. This is, I think, for AGC and ASEAN also need to think in the future how to increase dialogue between ASEAN competition and forces. We can take example from European competition and work, which I believe they also want to improve more in their the engagement activities. So we need to strengthen this enforcer network. We want to talk experience more so that we can know how to build a better cooperation. As initial stage, cooperation in mergers will be important because I know that from OECD ASEAN survey conducted by Professor Jenny last year, show that there's an interest trend for international cooperation in handling merger cases and also cartel cases. So it's good for us that we have the information portal for merger cases in line for our next deliverables in this year and also in next year. This is in line with what the international community have, that we need to start with merger cooperation. That is why information portal for merger cases is something that very important to us, for ASEAN. And because this portal will provide us with a lot of information on mechanism on information sharing, list of data that can be exchanged related to cross-border merger transaction, procedure for notification, and also how the result of the merger assessment by the authorities. This will help us to engage more cooperation on merger in the future, I believe. So, and then if I believe Asana also has asked in her initial remark that how we should deal with government in order to anticipate the future crisis. So first, we need to be in line with them. We have business to grow. Yeah, we need to provide them with some relaxation, help them to grow to back on the feet. We need to provide a lot of advocacy to the government. We need to intervene government when they want to produce some policies. We understand that during this time a lot of state intervention to certain industry or players, so especially state-owned enterprise. Yeah, but we need to still continuously advocate government on their intervention in certain sector. We need to increase our advocacy to the government, and then lastly, we need to generally improve our micro and small medium enterprises. We need to help them to grow during this pandemic, during this economic recovery, because the SME is the most vital players in our economy, especially in Indonesia. So that's why we need to also try to help as our SME to grow. We need to protect them from the abuse or from the larger players. So we need to also to improve our dissemination activities with the SME player for that, to explain that, to inform that they are being protected in the way for them to grow, to expand the market. That there's a competition authority who have a role to protect them from the abuses or conduct from larger enterprises. This is what important, because in some cases they don't know that they are being protected from the abuse. We talk with a lot of SME association, and they didn't know that there is a way for them to make a complaint on the larger enterprise done to them. So this is something that also important during this recovery period, and also for anticipate further crisis, to strengthen our SME, the backbone of our community. So with that, I conclude my remarks. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Deswen, for your comprehensive feedback. We particularly note the work of the AGC that you've highlighted and the need to strengthen the role of the ASEAN Competition Enforcers Network. Thank you so much for your intervention. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now hear the views of Dr. Casey Lee, who is the Senior Fellow and Coordinator of the Regional Economic Studies Program at the ICS Yusof Ishak Institute of Singapore. And prior to joining ICS, Dr. Lee held academic appointments at the University of Wollongong, Nottingham University Business School, Malaysia, and the University of Malaya. Dr. Casey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. I don't have a regulatory background, mostly an academic and a think tank researcher, so I'll speak from that perspective. In terms of cooperations, maybe in terms of and capacity building that needs to be done at the ASEAN level. I think we should begin by contextualizing the question of cooperation in terms of the different experience of ASEAN member countries in this pandemic. Yes, the pandemic has had very severe impact in terms of lost life, economic disruption, but you do see very, very different levels of experience, partly to do with the uneven level of preparedness, for example, in the health sector across different countries, and the kind of economic resources that were levied to deal with the pandemic. And of course, in relation to that, the uneven access of vaccine across ASEAN countries, resulting in different rates of vaccination and their ability to recover. Having said this context also is important, I think, in studying one of the key elements that competition authorities should study, i.e., the kind of structural changes that have occurred and are occurring in markets, by distinguishing between what are the short-term and long-term changes. Short-term changes that are brought about by disruptions in essential goods and supply chains, and also border closures. Although they are short-term, but they can have long-term impacts. There are also long-term changes, structural changes that have been discussed in previous panels. For example, the pace of digital transformation is one. The second is because of the economic disruption, the effect of entry-exit of businesses and how it affects different markets and different countries, actually. The other kind of important issue to look at, of course, is the role of the state and market competition when you have, a situation that, for example, the importance of distribution of essential goods, right? We heard about the panic buying and price gouging. These are important topics resulting in quantity rationing and pricing. And from my own research, for example, if you look at the online prices of grocery goods, for example, what is interesting is not so much sometimes the number of COVID cases, but the border closures that affect the supply shocks that then reverberates into these online markets. So these are the things that needs further study, I think, and require cooperation, because for countries, for example, sharing mutual borders, like for example, Singapore and Malaysia and Thailand with many more countries, Myanmar, Laos and Cambodia. The cross-border effects impact on markets are very, very important to study. That's one lesson for cooperation moving forward. The other one is, of course, the importance of market monitoring, especially in the digital sphere, for example. Not only during times of demand and supply shocks, but also the recovery times. It's important for ASEAN competition authorities to sort of pull together their resources to kind of study what's happening in the digital markets in this regard, because the kind of data that is involved, for example, high frequency online prices and technology that is required to study may not reside in one single competition authority. This requires then a sort of like capacity building in this area. I'll talk a bit more about that. In terms of future crisis, we know it's almost impossible to predict what a future crisis looks like, right? But of course, another pandemic is just a question of time. There are, of course, long-term concerns that we are already witnessing that can have impact can bring about future crises. One is climate change, for example. What is the impact of climate change on natural disasters, and how does it impact markets and market structure and state response in all sorts of market relating to food, energy, logistics, and stuff like that. The importance of resilience of market, and how is resilience, for example, and robustness related to competition in markets. That is a narrative that is important to highlight, and I think ASEAN Competition Agency should look at this kind of issues. There are also geopolitics, right? The US-China trade and technology conflict affecting may have impact on competition-related issues. For example, in 5G markets and their rollout, who is allowed to participate in these markets based on national security issues and not competition issues? How do competition agencies, for example, what voice do they have? And in this kind of matters, it's important in terms of competition, market access, and even mergers, actually. In relation to this, when we talk about digital transformation, is the rise of industrial policies, I call for digital transformation. The importance of this topic, I think, requires competition agencies in ASEAN countries to take a look at what are the domestic and cross-border competition issues that are related to this. And I'm quite happy to like, if these issues are kind of like discussed among, if it's discussed among ASEAN senior economic ministers. Another rising issue that is sort of like being highlighted in the pandemic times is inequality, right? The impact of inequality due to, in these pandemic times. Competition, because, if you look at the study of welfare effects in competition, right? There is a distributive element. In the previous panel, we heard about discussion of transferring consumer surplus to producer surplus through pricing. So issues of inequality is an important one that is an important narrative that competition agencies should also seriously think about it. And in this narrative, I think SMEs come into play within this topic. And finally, I think competition agencies also may want to cooperate and sometimes have a forward-looking agenda, right? Taking lessons from economic history, shocks and long-term trends. What are the effects on institutions, governance, competition, and the importance of, in this regard, I repeat, the importance of competition agencies' capabilities and innovation. It is time also, I think, to seriously look at the notion of research and development funds as a kind of important component of competition agency cooperation, and also individually, also as in the cooperation sphere. It is not a luxury expenditure that only competition agencies in richer countries can afford and should do. I believe to overcome lack of resources, there should be more pooling of regional efforts. For example, when you talk about the digital economy, it intersects three areas like law, economics, and computational science, right? How do you, for example, make sense of algorithms? Are computation agencies investigate? Do they even know what algorithms look like? What kind of learning algorithms, at the very minimum, for example, bring a tacit collusion? These are questions of capacity building that needs to be built up, more sort of like expanding the multidisciplinary capacity of competition agencies. Work should start now on, as I said, finally, new narrative on the importance of competition policy and law in future crisis, which is evidence-based, and then embedding competition issue in this policy narrative in a future planning kind of mode is important. And the pandemic, I think, and as well as the digital transformation that we are undergoing, highlight the kind of need, and perhaps regional cooperation should begin to focus on some of these issues. That's all the points I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Casey, for an enlightening intervention. We noted the types of disruptions, short-term and long-term, that you've outlined earlier that can affect competition in the region, and the need for competition authorities to practically understand the implications to market structure of these disruptions, and the importance for competition authorities to also invest in R&D and the capacity building efforts. So thank you so much for your intervention. We are pleased to welcome our next speaker, Professor Frederick Jenny, who is chairman of the OECD Competition Committee. He is also a professor at the ESSEC Paris Business School and is the head of the International Committee of the Review Concurrences. He is also the co-director of the European Center for Law and Economics of ESSEC since 2008. Professor Frederick Jenner, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you for this really interesting debate. And I note that a lot of things very useful to this debate have already been mentioned by my predecessor in this discussion, which is going to make my life easier. So let me take a slightly different focus, but to say things which are going to be convergent with what has been mentioned before. And let me divide the issues between current challenges and longer-term challenges to competition authorities, and then to try to draw from this, what does that mean in terms of cooperation among competition authorities? Now, I start with current challenges because it's one thing to talk about future crises, but I'm afraid that we are in a current crisis, which is far from being finished. I mean, we see that there is a continuous disruption of supply chains. We see that the COVID crisis continues, goes back and forth, and even if in in the second quarter, the OECD preliminary data show that there was a strong rebound of the economic activity, this may not be the case for the coming quarters. So in the current crisis, as it continues, what are the issues that are facing competition authorities and that come from public policy? Well, the first one is, as we said, the disruption of the supply chains, which may come either from other countries being affected by the same problems or from the measures which are taken by governments to try to limit the spread of the virus. I note, for example, that the ASEAN Hanoi Action Plan, which suggests that efforts should be made to strengthening supply chain connectivity in the long term, is very important and continues to be extremely relevant. But at the level of the competition authorities, I would say daily task, what are we confronted with? Well, we're confronted with a real possibility that there's going to be an increase in concentration in a number of sectors once government have run out of money to try to prevent the changes. And this increase in concentration is going to go through either through mergers or bankruptcies after the end of public support. So increase in concentration means decrease in competition in the sectors which are affected, and that requires, of course, competition authorities to be able to react to this. We are going to be faced with an increasing number of requests for exempting crisis cartels, which had been very prevalent up until the 1990s, that disappeared because of the economic expansion, but are going to come back. And also in merger control, we're going to be faced with requests for failing firm defense, mergers that the firms will tell us are necessary because one or several of the parties were failing in any case, given the shifts in demand. We are faced also with structural shifts in demand, indeed, between sectors. And finally, government proposals, either to promote cartels or to promote mergers, or, as we've just heard, to engage in protectionist measures. Now, all of those factors lead to a reduction, a restriction in competition, and competition authority, either in their enforcement activity or in their advocacy activity, are going to have to react to those challenges. So what is the role of the competition, the common role of all the competition authorities in this? Is to maintain their strict standard of enforcement, taking the environment into consideration in order to maintain openness and flexibility of markets. What we're faced with is massive reallocation of resources. I'm going to come back to this. And we want the mechanism, the market mechanism, to facilitate this reallocation of resources. So when we think about mergers, when we think about cartel or crisis cartel defense, we must ask ourselves, are we unduly restricting the normal reallocation of resources which comes with the COVID crisis? So that's one dimension on the enforcement side. On the advocacy side, of course, competition authorities have a huge task to explain to government that some measures may be unduly restrictive of competition. And I'm talking here about trade measures, for example, or about measures to foster a cartel crisis. So again, all the competition authorities of the ASEAN region, just like the competition authorities of other regions, are faced with the need to bring up their advocacy to government and to engage in discussion with government to try to find better ways to solve the crisis. But now let me turn to a longer term or more permanent issues which we're facing. And there, I think that we should not look at the COVID crisis in isolation. We should be aware of the fact that there have been at least 4 very disruptive events on competition with an impact on competition since 2008. We've had the financial and economic crisis of 2008. We have concern about the climate change, and we have the rise of the digital economy, which has been talked about earlier, together with the COVID crisis. And what are the common lessons from those 4 events? First of all, the fact that government intervention to hasten the return to equilibrium may be necessary because competitive markets work, but they work very well in a stable environment. And when there is a sudden shock to the economy, they tend to adjust sometimes too slowly. We have seen this in the COVID crisis. We have seen this in the financial crisis. So the question is, what is the scope for government intervention that would not disrupt competition, but would help market readjust to as fast as possible so as to avoid the negative impact of their imbalance? Second, we've learned that globalization has increased our dependence on foreign suppliers, made our economies completely interdependent. And the question there is whether market development should be complemented by longer-term perspective to ensure resiliency in the economic system. And a sub-question of this is, what is the proper time focus for competition analysis? Are we too focused on short-term issues? And should we have a wider vision of our mandate of competition? The next question is the question of the negative externality. Certainly the COVID crisis is very important, but this is also an issue, of course, with the climate change. So there is a public bad which goes along with the production and the distribution of goods and services. And the question is, can competition law integrate the environmental dimension into its analysis? Is contributing to the environment an efficiency that needs to be taken into account when we make a judgment on the admissibility or the lack of admissibility of a cartel or an abuse of dominance position or a merger? The next question is digital sector. Much has been said about it. I'm not going to spend long on this, but clearly what we need are redesigned instruments because our instruments are very well adjusted to competition among pipeline firms on markets, but they are less well adapted to competition among ecosystem across markets. So there we need to retool ourselves. And the last challenge that we're facing is the massive reallocation of resources, which is implied by the climate change, by the COVID crisis, and by the rise of the digital economy. And what we have learned is that this reallocation of resources takes place very slowly, particularly slowly when it comes to the labor factor, for example. So all competition authorities in the ASEAN, like in the rest of the world, are faced simultaneously with those deep questions that engage the long-term future. What is interesting is that we are all facing them at the same time. There are new questions for all competition authorities, irrespective of whether the competition authority is recent or an old competition or more ancient competition authority. So what could we do? Well, we need to have flexible competition law. We need to design new instruments. Flexible, I mean like this, for example, what happened during the COVID crisis when there was consideration of cooperation agreement. For example, you may remember that the Bundeskartellamt authorized a cartel among manufacturers of automobiles, not a cartel, but a cooperation agreement, because it thought that this was a proportionate and acceptable way to solve a severe disruption on the car market. Now, there was some creativity and taking into consideration the severe disruption which had been brought about by the COVID crisis. So we need to be able to find ways to make competition law flexible while at the same time maintaining the standards. The second thing, of course, is that we need to increase our advocacy effort, as I already mentioned and others have already mentioned, to advocate for structural and regulatory pro-competitive reforms, to remove unnecessary regulatory barriers to competition, but also in areas where there is a market failure to ensure that the new regulations are not unduly restrictive of competition. And competition authorities are the only ones to be able to do that. Now, I note, for example, that the OECD has already worked closely with the ASEAN in the last 3 years on competitive neutrality, which was mentioned by Mr. Bedisakan, for the e-commerce sector and also for the logistics service sector. And what is interesting is that those two sectors, where hundreds of recommendations were proposed to remove obstacles to competition, are sectors which are very much part of the vertical supply chains and therefore have a huge importance over the economies. Now, there are low-cost regulatory solutions that make existing infrastructure work better. This is why the ASEAN ministers were interested in this project and why the regional reports were launched at the 53rd ASEAN Economic Ministerial meeting in September by all 10 economic ministers of the ASEAN. So collective efforts to try to address some of those fundamental challenges that we have in front of us due to the combination of several disruptions. And that leads me to the last point, which is how can we cooperate? Much has been said about not only the fact that cooperation is crucial, but also that cooperation is urgently needed. Now, there can be cooperation at various levels. At the substantive level, as I have mentioned, to sort out some of those new challenges that we are facing and try to find adequate solutions for competition law enforcement. At the level of legal frameworks, what kind of provisions actually work and in which circumstances do they work well, and what kind of provisions should be adapted to their environment. At the level of cases, exchange of information, and also finally at the level of experience of competition authorities in their general environment. Now, this is very much what we try to promote in our work at the OECD, both in the committee, but also with our capacity building effort with the OECD KPC Center in Seoul, Korea. We have issued a number of reports during the COVID-19 crisis to help governments and competition authorities deal with the crisis. We have also held numerous workshops for case handlers as well as heads of agency of the Asia-Pacific region on the crisis. I note that the ASEAN joint statement recognizes the importance of ensuring the timely exchange of information and facilitating the sharing of best practices between competition authorities to address anti-competitive activity amidst the pandemic. And I must say that not only can the ASEAN Competition Action Plan 2025, which was just recently updated, provide a cooperative mechanism that can contribute to enhancing information exchange between the member states and the competition authorities. For example, if I think of the information portal on merger cases, which is supposed to be established by 2023. But I must say that regional cooperation is particularly important. This is, in fact, a reason why at OECD we have established regional centers in Latin America, in the Middle East, and in Asia, because we have found that countries that know each other sometimes have similar issues, are more keen to cooperate together just because of this proximity. So this help. And this is why ASEAN has such an important role in promoting this cooperation. Now, there's been reference to the ECN, the European Competition Network. Now, the ECN was created in a particular institutional environment, which I think is not directly transmissible to the ASEAN region, but some of the processes of the ECN may be looked at with great interest for the ASEAN cooperation, because some of those processes could be adopted, such as, for example, the fact that the ECN operates with very little staff or no permanent staff, operates principally through an electronic platform developed by the IT department of DG Comp, where standard information such as the authority handling the case, the products involved, the parties and the territories involved, the alleged infringement, its origin, duration can be uploaded and then shared between competition authorities, which is very useful for each competition authorities to know what the others are doing and how far along they are in cases. So I would suggest that the ASEAN is the proper regional forum to develop cooperation, both on enforcement, but also on advocacy, and that lessons can be learned from some of the other regional forums where there is already fairly active and deep cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Frederick Jenny, for such an enlightening intervention, highlighting the long-term and short-term crises that are being faced by competition authorities and countries at large, and also the suggested solutions, and in particular advocating for structural and pro-competitive reforms in areas where there are potentially market failures, among the many solutions that you've suggested. Perhaps before I move on to our next speaker, maybe if I could invite our two competition authorities here present today, Chairman Balisacan and also Mr. Desmond, to perhaps respond to the crises that have been or potential challenges that have been highlighted by both Dr. Casey and Professor Frederick Jenny, and including maybe the lessons learned that you've adopted from the current crises in order to anticipate the future crisis. Maybe I can invite Chairman Balisacan for your intervention. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. I think the issues and challenges raised by both Professor Casili and Chair Frederick Jenny are so are very relevant and so crucial, I think, for ASEAN. I think that recognizing that we don't know much about the role of competition authorities in relation to the evolving pandemic and the challenges way ahead, at least in the long term, is partly arises from the fact that within our region, particularly among the developing countries in the region, we don't invest much in R&D, as R&D was noted by Professor Lee. No? I think the difficulty within ASEAN is that we are so diverse. Economies are so diverse. we have very far advanced economy and a very, the lower levels of development, and this make cooperation a bit harder than usual, compared, for example, to what you might see in EU or in North America or even in Latin America, for that matter. So that recognition has to be clear to us, and I guess the challenge is finding those niches, those areas of cooperation that will work well for all the member countries. Um, I think that what I see as as a useful approach is what is described by Chair Jenny, that we have to look at at cooperation in terms of various layers. At that substantive level, maybe there, can find some commonalities there at the experiences of countries. For example, I feel that when we were interacting with our colleagues from Cambodia and from Malaysia. Malaysia is far more advanced than the Philippines economically, right? But there are some common trends that we see as important areas for collaboration, especially in transborder cases. I think the those transborder cases that emphasized by Professor Lee are probably areas of concerns that are quite common across countries. But obviously, there are some economies within our region that are far ahead in being able to adapt to those issues than many of the other countries. For example, Singapore has no problem with quickly responding to these issues because there's so much resources they can deploy. And apart from the fact, of course, that the competition authority in Singapore has been quite mature and developed so many experiences in dealing with these issues. No, I really feel also that the tools of competition authorities, particularly among the developing countries and the young ones, would really need some upgrading, I would say. Not even upgrading, it's even coming up with something useful. What I find quite challenging initially when I was forming we were developing the PCC was that it was clear to us that the regimes, the law that we adopted, particularly the merger regime, was very much EU. So we have borrowed a lot of those concepts in EU, and in enforcement we have abuse of dominance. We have borrowed a lot from the US, but the economists in me, tell me that we have to nuance these concepts because these concepts evolved in a context where economic development context where we may not be there because there are, for example, in our country, and I believe that's also true for Indonesia, for Cambodia, for Vietnam. Many of the markets are either non-existent or are fairly underdeveloped. Partly because of the in the particular case of Indonesia and the Philippines, for example, where we have archipelagic countries. So the small islands in our country are like countries by themselves. They are separated by high transport costs, and so they are not really integrated with the mainstream. And so if you adopt a competition law or tools like say merger tools, assuming that all these geographic areas are well integrated, that may mislead you and may mislead us. And that became very clear when we are looking at issues, especially trans-border mergers, because we see that even in small economies, small island economies, separated by high transport cost and logistic issues, you see this as separate markets. Separate markets that are not quite not responsive to any changes in the mainland, and so we have a lot of those problems that we encountered initially as we develop our lenses and assessing mergers and doing defining relevant markets and so on. So that is an area where the ASEAN can take a role, in helping develop, facilitating the development of those tools that are relevant for the not only just for the region but for specific countries within the region, so that we can grow and move the integration of the economies faster. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much for your intervention, Chairman Balisacan. May I ask Pa Deswin maybe to share his views, but maybe noting the time. Maybe in 2 minutes, Pa Deswin, if you can.
Sure. So what we can learn from what Casey and Professor Jenny explains, that first, if you talk about, now we are entering a borderless market, right? So any player can compete in our regions. So we need to foster. So with that lesson, we need to foster to speed up our level of cooperation. We need to speed up our level of cooperation. We have all member states with their own competition law, but we have different gaps. So we need to speed this capacity. We need to speed level of cooperation. We need to vision that ASEAN competition enforcer network to be the next European competition network. AGC can focus on the sectoral, as a sectoral body, focus on the policy level, try to achieve ASEAN competition policy blueprint. But in terms of cooperation, we need to strengthen ASEAN to in order for us to speed up this cooperation. That one, and then the second, I agree with Professor Jenny. The state intervention is rising during this pandemic. The state don't have money to help everyone, to help the company to back to their feet. The state don't have enough money to recover from this pandemic. So what they did is to invite big multinational companies or big conglomerates to invest to on certain asset in domestic asset and build joint venture company to help with to manage with the asset. What we are afraid is that this transaction in the future, all the invested money, all the provided money by the big conglomerate will be as a share swap. So with that, our asset will be easily transformed to these big conglomerates will be privatized. This is something that we need to anticipate in the future as a competition authority. And then also we need to discuss competition policy in the regional level. We need to start to discuss competition, the impact of cross-border trade in the competition. So this is something that I think we need to start to discuss in the future based on what we have learned so far. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deswin. Thank you very much, all commentators, for your intervention. I will now would like to provide the opportunity for the speaker, the presenters, Mr. Ali Salmande, who is an expert staff of the member of Indonesian Parliament, and Ms. Latifa Kusumawardani, who is a partner at Gafar & Co. law firm, to present their paper on the leniency program in Indonesian competition law revision bill, a lessons learned from the EU and cooperation in the UNSPTA framework. So Mr. Ali and Ms. Latifa, please take.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity and the time, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Latifa, and my colleague, Mr. Ali Salmande, will present our paper in 10 minutes given. Next slide, please. Okay, before starting our presentation, let us show our deepest condolences on the passing of Chairman of the Indonesian Competition Commission, ICC, Bapak Mr. Kodrat Wibowo. May he rest in peace with the Almighty. Next slide, please. Okay, we will skip this slide. Next slide, please. Okay. Thank you for the background. Why we choose this topic is since we are currently in the pandemic situation in the 2 past years. And one of the implication is like high demand on the medical and hygiene industry that is caused some concerns about the emergence of cartels in these crucial sectors. And assured by 2020, the ICC attempt to follow up and explore information on the potential cartels by the companies in the health sector. However, cartel in Indonesia is such difficult to prove since in some cases the Indonesian court didn't acknowledge about the indirect evidence. Therefore, we discuss in our paper regarding the leniency program as one the implementation of the leniency program in Indonesia as one of the alternatives. Next slides. Yeah, starting this slide will be presented by Mr. Ali. Mr. Ali, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Latifa. I will continue the presentation by explaining about the leniency program in the EU. As I think all the speakers, all the panelists already know about it, there's 2 types of reward that will be given to cartel participants who involved to become the justice collaborator in the cartel activities. First, total immunity, and the second, reduction of fines. The total immunity will be given to the cartel justice collaborator who firstly report cartel activities by bringing very significant evidence. And the second rewards a reduction of fines into 20 until 50% of total penalty will be given to the second, third, fourth cartel participant who provide additional information by bringing significant added value evidence. Next slide. Okay. Besides the leniency program, we also discuss about the cooperation or the relationship between the EU competition authorities and the competition authorities at the EU member state at the national level. They are separately independent with each other, but they have cooperation in form of European competition network. I believe it's already mentioned by most of the panelists that we can take example, a lesson learned from a European competition network. Next slide. Okay. I will go to our main topic to discuss discourse of implementing leniency program in Indonesian legislation. In Indonesia, we already have a competition law number 5, 1999, and the government and the parliament is willing to amend the law actually since 5 years ago. In the revision, in the bill of revision has introduced leniency program in Article 70, and the bill has been intensively discussed by the parliament and the government in 2019 in the previous period of Indonesian parliament, but unfortunately failed to be passed into the law. But however, currently the bill still has been included in the list of the national legislation program in 2020, 2024, and we hope that it will be discussed again in the next near future, or in 2022 or 2023 if it's set into priority. There's one article in the bill, the revision bill that regulate Indonesia program. The bill provides ICC, Indonesian Competition Commission, authority to determine immunity or sentence reduction in leniency program. And the leniency program will not only cover cartel activity, but all the form of prohibited agreements in the law, such as oligopoly, prefixing, and etc. But however, we believe that the provision of leniency program is not really enough to make it more effective because we think it should be regulated in the more details, like how many reduction fine that will be given to the whistleblower or justice collaborator, or how about the process of joining this program. I think it should be regulated in more detail in the bill. Next slide. Okay, beside the bill, we also propose that there's also the provision to regulate about the cooperation and network in the bill for Indonesian Competition Commission to work with other competition authority in ASEAN, Australia, or New Zealand. First, we encourage the ICC to cooperate with other competition commission in the ASEAN. I believe it has been done right now, as Pak Desvin mentioned before. But I think we agree that the cooperation should be improved to be more significant and effective network of cooperation. And in the context of ANZTVA framework, this is the basis rule. Each party respects the sovereignty of its members country to enforce competition policy. I think the competition network or cooperation should still take this sovereignty issue as the main important thing. And the last, the communication with ANZPTA countries to prepare a legal basis for in our paper leniency program. For example, like now currently in Indonesia, we want to regulate leniency program, so maybe there will be a more productive or significant discussion, best practice for other ANZPTA's member states who already implement this program in their country, like in Australia, in New Zealand, and also in Philippines that Mr. Barisakan mentioned before. Okay, next. Okay, we will go to our conclusion. Indonesia urgently needs a leniency program to dismantle cartel conduct, especially in the COVID-19 pandemic, where consumers very much need health sector goods. And the leniency program in the bill of the revision of Indonesian competition law is not detailed enough currently, so I think it should be improved when it will be discussed again in the parliament. And the legislature should apply the type of immunity and the amount of reduction bill in the bill. It should be stated detailed in the bill, not letting the ICC determine it by itself. And the third, the Indonesian government and parliament must continuously support ICC to continue establishing cooperation in the region within the ASEAN Economic Community. This is what I mentioned before. I think it will be better if there's one provision, two provision, like European competition network, who I think stated in the Treaty of European Union and Treaty of the Functioning European Union. So it can be done in the revision of the bill of Indonesian competition law. And fourth, lastly, the form of cooperation at the ASEAN level, including the framework of ANZPTA, should be carried out to strengthen legislation and legal basis in forming effective competition regulations, such as setting the leniency program like we discussed in our paper. Okay, next. Yeah, okay, thank you. I think that's the end of our presentation of our paper, and we would like to hear some feedback from the panels or for the all participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ali and Ms. Latifa, for the presentation. I note that we need to move on to the Q&A session, but perhaps I would like to provide the opportunity for the commentators to possibly respond to the presentation. And so can I offer the floor to Mr. Deswen to provide your response?
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Thanks for Ali and Ms. Latifa for your paper. Yeah, we agree that the amendment of competition law is pending now. It's failed to move to the plenary in 2019. Leniency part of it. And we also understand that now Commission 6 of Indonesian Parliament want to finish adopting law one at a time, once at a time. So now they focus on state-owned enterprise law. So next, after the SOE law finished, they promise to discuss competition law amendment. We do hope Pali can encourage the Parliament to start discuss the competition law. We also, meanwhile, during the absence of leniency, we try to introduce exchange of behavior rules. This is the rules where the business can apply during the preliminary hearing and the commission for them to confess and then apply for changing the behavior. With that, they don't need to follow the procedure up until decisions. Now we have that procedures to replace leniency at the time. Now we want to expand the exchange of behavior mechanism in the earliest time during investigation. We do hope this can replace leniency leniency procedures while waiting the amendment. That's what we try to do. But we also understand that if we try to relate leniency, the decision of leniency with the cooperation, the absence of leniency program may not be the proper answer to promote cooperation. Why? Because cartel members may refrain from applying leniency when they don't assure that about they don't know issue about confidentiality information and the evidence they provide, because such information they provide during the leniency may lead to sometimes to damage claim under public lawsuits and even can start an investigation in other jurisdictions. I think one of my colleagues know about this case in ASEAN, and also probably other jurisdictions will start investigation where they did not apply for leniency, or even they cannot apply for leniency, because not all member states in ASEAN have the leniency program. I believe 3 of us don't have the leniency application program. And also, sometimes we also will face with potential retaliation by other cartel members. This will reduce the incentive for leniency. So at some time, competition authority may need to set a rule on the terms for them to cooperate and share information with other competition authorities. So for us to improve cooperation in absence of leniency? First, we need to find a way to safeguard confidential information. ASEAN member states should think about providing agreed confidentiality waiver mechanism and establish safeguard concerning the treatment of confidential information obtained from another competition authority. That's important for us to have a good leniency to promote cooperation. And second, we need to find a way to coordinate sanctions and remedies, because when applying competition law, especially in merger or cartel cases, member states should aim at the resolution of domestic competitive concern arising from the particular case and should endeavor to avoid inconsistencies with remedies sought in other referring jurisdiction. So we also need to talk about how to coordinate our sanctions and remedies. And also we need to find a way to align the timing of our enforcement activities, because sometimes company apply leniency in one country, and then after some month, then they apply leniency to another jurisdiction. This will make us difficult in aligning our enforcement, the timing of our enforcement activities. So that's why ASEAN also we need to find a way to align this enforcement, the timing of this enforcement activity. I think those are the three things that we need to provide in order to have a good, let's say, a good leniency program that support or encourage more cooperation between member states in the future. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Pak Deswin, and thank you, presenters, for your presentation. We will move on to the last part of our session today, which is the Q&A. There are a number of questions that have been brought forward to us through Slido. So perhaps I'll just select one of the questions. And I would like to perhaps request our Professor Frederick Jenny and also Dr. Casey to maybe address this question. What are the concrete ways to speed up ASEAN regional integration and competition policy?
Well, I'm not sure I'm the best place to tell the ASEAN member states what is the best way to speed up their regional integration. I think that Arsenio Bedisaken has mentioned earlier some of the specific difficulties, the fact that the countries were very far apart and that there were sometimes at different levels of development in their competition law and policy. But to be honest, I think that the best way to promote this is to have the ASEAN as an institution push this agenda. I mean, the ASEAN has done a lot, first of all, to spread competition law throughout the region already. And this has led to a very positive result, countries adopting a competition law when they didn't have one. Second, I think that the ASEAN as an institution is trusted by the ASEAN countries, and I cannot underemphasize the importance of trust in cooperation. So if you want to push cooperation, you have to feel comfortable with either the organization or the member states with whom you cooperate. And this is one of the reasons why very often the regional level is equally important, or sometimes even more important than a more multilateral or international level. So that's my second thing. The third thing, I think, is to push specific projects. In other words, to define projects which are really an issue for many competition authorities in the region. So very often that requires to start from fairly pragmatic problems which are raised with various competition authorities, because that's where there is going to be the highest incentive for the competition authorities of the member states to cooperate. If I may, can I make just a very short comment on the leniency, because this was an example an example of a concrete issue which is of interest to all the competition authorities and where we heard that more cooperation would be needed. I just want to point out that even in Europe, there have been countries where the leniency program has not been so successful. One of those countries, for example, is Greece, where there have been very, very few leniency applications. And I think there are several factors that one should keep in mind. One of them is that leniency is one of the instruments to help competition authorities develop cases. There are also other instruments, like the development of screens for competition problems, which is a second one. So if leniency doesn't work in a country, you might want to think about some of those other elements as well. The second thing is that, of course, in small countries where everybody knows everybody else, maybe the culture is not going to be very conducive to leniency because it is kind of a social norm that you don't do that. And this is partly, by the way, the problem in Greece. The third issue is to really coordinate the leniency program with the sanctioning part of the enforcement. What may incentivize firms to apply for leniency is the fear of getting a serious fine. Now, if we have a country that has a leniency program but very low level of fines and or doesn't apply the fines very often, nobody is afraid of the competition authority and there is no reason for the leniency program to be used. So I just want to point out that it's also useful to think in terms of increasing the enforcement and increasing the severity of the sanction in order to make the leniency more successful.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your insights. Dr. Casey, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think it's useful to remember that when we talk about ASEAN regional integration, there are two dimensions. People talk about intra-ASEAN trade, right? But also looking at ASEAN as a part of the global production hub, actually. Those two dimensions are important. That means that for competition policy to sort of facilitate ASEAN regional integration, it would mean going beyond looking at just the domestic trade agenda, right? But looking at cross-border trade issues as well as cross-border investment issues. And that would then entails including things like mergers. The other one I would like to sort of raise is as just a question mark. I'm not quite sure whether the importance of convergence in terms of competition law across the region, which would sort of like facilitate, investments that cross-border investments and also market access. I think, that's that 2 points I have in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Casey. Maybe we'll take up one more question. It's how do we ensure a balanced approach is maintained between promoting a competitive marketplace and government interventions, especially in times of crisis? Perhaps Professor Frederick Jenny again, would you like to take the floor?
This is a very difficult question, but a very relevant question, because as I said, I took very rapidly the example of the German cartel case among automobile manufacturers. Now, one issue that came very often during the COVID crisis time was the fact that competition authorities are not favorable, I would say as a matter of principle, to cooperation among competitors. Now, in the case of a disruption, you do have new problems. And one of the new problems, for example, is where are you going to get the spare parts when the global value chain has been disrupted, and who is going to benefit from it? There may be also other issues. How do you develop as fast as possible cars that are going to save on fuel in order to promote climate, to eliminate climate change, or at least to contribute not to aggravate climate change. And there may be R&D issues. And there may be the possibility that some cooperation may be useful between the firms. This has certainly been the case in the development of vaccines against COVID, where cooperation among the pharmaceutical companies has sped up, allowed us to go faster finding vaccines. So what is the role of competition authorities there? Well, the role of the competition authority is not to say, oh, this is an agreement among competitors, so I don't want to hear about it. But to say, okay, if there is a reasonable, a reasonably convincing reason to believe that some good is going to come out of this cooperation, faster than what the market would allow, or even allow the development of that good. I want to be very precise on what the cooperation is going to entail and what are the limits, both in terms of scope and in terms of duration of this cooperation. And in order to make sure that this cooperation doesn't turn into a generalized exchange of information that goes on forever and reduces competition in the industry. And when you look at the decisions which have been made by competition authorities throughout the world, it is this fine-tuning of finding the direct link between the cooperation and the possibility of acceleration or development of or solving of an issue. Second, what are the minimal conditions of this cooperation? And third, what is the monitoring of this cooperation? And for example, the EU has imposed on several of those agreements reporting obligations every month or very frequently to be able to monitor the fact that the cooperation doesn't go beyond what is strictly necessary to get the good. So I think that this is a way to try to combine the push by government to say to its pharmaceutical firms or its automobile manufacturers, try to get together to improve the situation in your market, and the role of the competition authority, which is to make good safeguards to make sure that this doesn't turn into an anti-competitive practice.
Thank you very much, Professor Jenny, for your intervention. Appreciate it. I guess it's 4:35. We've run out of time, unfortunately, although there are much to discuss. But perhaps let me wrap up our discussion today. From the presentations of the 5 speakers, there were various recommendations provided. We noted that the competition principles is integral to restore balance, market efficiency, avoid competition distortions, as well as protect consumers and MSMEs during the pandemic, as well as in its recovery phase. We noted the types of disruptions and challenges that can affect competition in the region, as well as the work of competition authorities, both long and short term. The challenges of increased digitalization has been mentioned repetitively by our speakers, and all of these factors emphasize the need for strengthened cooperation amongst ASEAN competition authorities by, among others, strengthening the role of the ASEAN Competition Enforcers Network. We also noted the importance for governments to invest in research in R&D and for competition authorities to invest in competition agencies' capabilities. In particular, to understand challenges in market structure that could possibly result in market concentration and anti-competitive activities. Moving forward, we noted from Professor Jenny that there is a need to be able to find ways to make competition more flexible while at the same time maintaining competition in markets. There is a recognition that in order to anticipate future crises, stronger cooperation is necessary by way of establishment of coordination mechanisms that would facilitate information sharing to enable member states to exchange knowledge on case facts, consult on timelines and theories of harm, and also highlighting the role of ASEAN as a ASEAN in terms of strengthening cooperation amongst member states in this regard. We note from Chairman Balisakan that competition advocacy must be directed towards reforms or measures that facilitates entry and greater competition in markets for essential goods and services, and also the camaraderie shown by ASEAN members, in particular, the exchanges between the advanced and younger competition authorities to apply the lessons learned in competition enforcement. We also noted the main objective of information portal of the information portal on merger cases, which is to be established by the AGC in 2023, which is for member states to identify and cooperate on enforcement actions on cross-border mergers and acquisition transactions. We also noted, finally, the paper which outlines the considerations for setting up in Indonesia's leniency program, and also the responses from the commentators outlining the factors affecting the effectiveness of leniency programs. So I guess that wraps up our discussion. Thank you very much to all speakers for your interventions, very enlightening discussion. And now I would like to pass on the floor to our convener, Ms. Gwen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and to the panel members and our speakers for panel 4. Before we proceed to our closing activities, allow me to offer a very brief wrap-up of today's discussions. Today, we joined 2 panel sessions, panel 3 on the rapid shift towards a digital economy and the risk to competition enforcement, and our recently concluded panel on strengthening cooperation in anticipation of future crises. Summing up the key points that have been surfaced across our 2 panels today, we can see distinct levels of digital adoption across the region, giving rise to varying competition concerns across ASEAN member states and abroad. COVID-19 has generally accelerated the shift to the digital economy and in some jurisdictions changed the existing landscape of competition. As concerns vary in scope and gravity, different strategic approaches have been developed as appropriate to address the evolving crisis in each AMS. Taking these together, my own key takeaways are: we need to continue to deepen our understanding of the digital economy at both national and regional levels, as well as the impact of the pandemic on ASEAN markets. We are also reminded to keep abreast of developments and initiatives around the globe so that the selected interventions, whether by competition enforcement or ex-ante regulation, assimilate or customize international developments in a way that is most appropriate for each jurisdiction. To be sure, online platforms have unique characteristics and emerging issues and concerns must be closely monitored. Legislators, regulators, and policymakers should be ready to identify the scope of competition enforcement and calibrate the overlap between competition and regulation, taking note of the effects of the pandemic and the requirements of recovery and sustainable development. These highlight the need for strategic capacity building, enhanced cooperation, and a flexible responsiveness on the part of competition authorities as they engage, whether in their enforcement or advocacy role, regulators, businesses, and consumers, particularly in anticipation of future crises. As a member of the academe, I appreciate in particular the need to support research activities with adequate resources, particularly as competition authorities are confronted by emerging issues affecting the digital economy and the complexities of how future crises may arise, whether financial or climate change and the environment. And lastly, cooperation has a number of aspects that have been pointed out in the course of our discussions today, particularly when we consider and appreciate the diversity in the ASEAN region. Effective cooperation may include sharing knowledge and imparting lessons learned, collaborating on identifying issues, coordinating in case of cross-border enforcement, sharing information, and striving for alignment or harmonization where possible. On a very positive note, cooperation is an ASEAN tradition, and efforts to enhance and strengthen cooperation will certainly continue. With deepest thanks to Vietnam, our host for the conference, and the ASEAN Secretariat, I am pleased to now introduce Mr. Trinh Antoine, Deputy Director General of Vietnam Competition and Consumer Authority, and invite him to formally close the 9th ASEAN Competition Conference. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Deputy Director General Trinh Antoine. Sir, you have the virtual floor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. His Excellency Sabinder Singh, Deputy Secretary General for the ASEAN Economic Community, Dr. Wutun Siapucha Saragit, Vice Chair for the ASEAN Head of Competition Agency meeting, Chairs of the Indonesia Competition Commission. His Excellency Nguyen Sinh Nhật Tân, Vice Minister of Industry and Trade of Republic of Vietnam, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I would like to express our sincere thanks for having me today, for closing the remark for the nice ACC and the Vietnam Commercial and Consumer Authority (VCCA) is very pleased to host this very important conference from the 1st and 2nd December in Hanoi. In cooperation with the ASEAN Secretariat, development partner, and other ASEAN competition agency. The COVID-19 pandemic has made it impossible for us to meet face-to-face directly, as we always did for the other ACC in the past. But it has not been able to prevent us from continuing to engage with each other, discuss the mutual issue, share best practice, and exchange viewpoints virtually. And I hope that all of you have enjoyed the enriching discussion with own section, speaker, panelists, moderator, convener we have with us during past 2 days. Through this conference, I believe that this good comparison practice will continue to be promoted, and mutual partnership with cooperation as enhanced not only among ASEAN Comparison Authority, but also with relevant stakeholders, including business and comparison experts, as well as with our dialogue and development partner. And I hope that in the future, more cooperation will be enhanced on our efforts towards the goals of ensuring effective comparison regime as in ASEAN and all member states, benefiting consumer and business alike in our region. For the VCCA, as a member of AEGC, we are aware of great importance that Vietnam has always placed on the cooperation with other ASEAN member states, relevant stakeholders and partners for promoting comparison in the region. And we commit to remain active in the cooperation work of AEGC, present and in the future as well. And closing this conference, I would like to express my sincere thanks to all member ASEAN Comparison Agency, the ASEAN Secretariat, Dialogue, and Develop partner for working hard on the presentation of this conference in this changing and challenging environment. Furthermore, I would like to thank all speakers, panelists, and moderators for their contribution to the success of the conference. And as I may know, there's more than 600 participants joined with the conference within 2 days. So I would like to express sincere thanks to all the participants for joining us and participating in this conference. And once again, I would like to thank all guests, speaker, panelists, convener, and the partner to join today's conference. And I do hope that we can see you soon in Vietnam in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deputy Director General Tin Antoine. I would like now to invite our co-convener, Ms. Alice Pham, to join me in concluding the conference program today. Before turning over to Alice, I would like to congratulate our host, the conference organizers, panel members, and to thank our guests, development partner, and participants. It has been an enriching 1.5 days, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to learn more about the cooperation among the AMS, the efforts of our competition authorities in the region, as well as emerging issues arising from the impact of the pandemic. It has been truly a distinct honor to support the 9th ASEAN Competition Conference, the ASEAN Secretariat, and our community. Thank you very much to my co-convener, Alice. As we also come closer to the end of the year, I wish to take this opportunity to extend my fervent wish for a healthier, better, and brighter 2022. Maraming salamat po. I'd like now to invite Alice for some final reminders and her parting remarks.
Thank you, Gwen. Same as Gwen, allow me to thank all of you for joining us for the past 1 day and a half and also remaining with us throughout the conference until this moment. It has been a great pleasure for both of us, the conveners, to participate and to contribute to this conference. We found that the professionalism, the dedication, and also the interactive engagement of this virtual conference is no less than any other direct in-person events in the ASEAN and beyond that we have participated in. As the speaker have done an excellent job of providing us with rich discussion and thought-provoking presentation. I think it's now time for the participants to help us, the organizers, by filling the evaluation form. So we help each other, you fill up the evaluation form, and we would be able to use this feedback to bring you more quality discussion and better events in the future. As the final parting word, allow me to wish all of you good health and happiness, safety and strength to overcome all the difficulty caused to us by this pandemic, as well as to take advantage of all the opportunities that it brings. I hope to see you all again soon in future ASEAN competition conference.